All right, the webinar is started.
Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to the second session of our biannual SoCal Social Work Women's Conference on Law and Ethics. I'm still getting used to not seeing an audience. I have to just trust you're there. My name is Brenda Wewell, and I'm the chair of the council. We've been providing this law and ethics training, Is Legal Always Ethical, for over 20 years. And some of you have actually been coming that long. I'm happy to welcome all of you, including longtime friends and those who are new to our conference. The council is a volunteer group of women who meet bi-monthly for a stimulating discussion related to social work and social justice. And then we take action on issues we care about. Most recently, we prepared and advocated for a resolution on public safety and social justice that was, I'm proud to say, adopted by the state NASW chapter. If you haven't seen it, go to the NASW chapter website for California. I'd like to especially thank our member, Laura Hernandez, who took on the job of learning our new virtual platform and has set everything up beautifully. She's our site host again for session 2, and we're so grateful for her technical abilities as well as dedication. I'd also like to thank Debbie Murad, a longtime council member who will again act as our Q&A monitor. So today, our full title for the whole conference is Defining Anti-Racist Social Work in the Context of Capitalist Systems and How We Work Towards Liberation. I can't introduce this topic without my heart filling with sorrow about the recent hate-motivated massacre of innocent people in Buffalo, and feel so distressed about the white supremacy and racism that swirls around us in so many ways. We can see how racist beliefs and attitudes and behaviors have been institutionalized, integrated, and normalized, and are reinforced within a capitalist system of profit-making. What does this mean for us as social workers and for our profession? We think there's a fundamental imbalance, and I've heard this in many ways in other venues as well, between law and our ethics as social workers about social justice that lies at the core of the battles we fight and the injustices we confront. And we see that everywhere, including in the institutions and the agencies where we work. Today, we're focusing on the child welfare system's family policing and regulation function and trying to envision a system transformation so that children and their families can be supported to thrive. We're glad you've joined us for this discussion. We really need a lot more voices and support as we explore these topics. I'd also like to start with the land acknowledgement, recognizing the history of American colonization and the esteemed traditions of our Native American ancestors. The SoCal Social Work Women's Council recognizes the Gabrieleño Tongva as the past, present, and future caretakers of the land, water, and resources in the unceded territory of Los Angeles. Here's a part of a traditional prayer that I really like to the ancestors. Giving thanks for the 8 directions, east, west, north, south, heaven, earth, that which is within me, and that which connects me to all else. Now for just a bit of housekeeping, just be aware during this seminar and the time of the conference that you can return to the landing page where you joined the webinar button at any time to download the session materials, and we have some really good ones today, or obtain contact info if you need technical assistance from the platform. The Zoom chat will be disabled during most of the session, and attendee microphones will be muted to reduce distractions. We encourage questions for the speakers and have scheduled time at the end for Q&A. You will have access to the question and answer box throughout the session. We'll monitor them, and during our question and answer time, ask as many to the speakers as possible within our time limits. Finally, the session is scheduled to run straight through without any official breaks, so you'll get the full 3 hours required for CEUs today. Finally, you may not feel comfortable 100% or totally with some of the materials or ideas we're presenting. This work is a part of a personal as well as a professional journey, and we encourage you to engage in mindful self-care and self-compassion throughout the time. I do hope you'll enjoy the program we've prepared. We have amazing speakers, and they have some really important information to share. It's directed at providing an educational overview, but also practical experience and suggestions that you might be able to try to implement. Now, I'm pleased to introduce Mara Ziegler, who will help facilitate and provide our program together with her co-panelists, Sabrina Forte, Sarah Clifton, and Yahniie Bridges. Mara is a senior licensed clinical social worker at Public Counsel on the Children's Rights Project's Transition Age Youth Team, and an adjunct professor at USC Suzanne Dwork Peck School of Social Work, teaching a variety of practice and policy courses to master's level social work students. Her focus is on youth who have current or former experience in foster care, particularly those experiencing parenting or expecting homelessness or have significant trauma. So let me turn it over to Mara.
Thank you, Brenda, for setting the stage so beautifully. Good morning, everyone. So yes, my name is Mara Ziegler, and I use the pronouns she, hers. I've been a social worker for approximately 4 decades, devoted all that time to working with youth and families impacted by the child welfare system. As Brenda mentioned, I'm proud to do that work at Public Counsel, which is the nation's largest pro bono, meaning free legal services organization. And at Public Counsel, we're dedicated to advancing equal justice and addressing economic, racial, and other inequities. The types of issues we address on the TAY team I'm part of include housing, education, government benefits, parenting rights, access to mental health and healthcare, and more. So yes, we're busy right now. And our team's direct impact work informs our systemic work at local and statewide levels, where we really want to stop intergenerational entry into the child welfare system. I also want to echo what Brenda said, that in today's presentation, as therapists, clinicians, advocates, attorneys, or however you identify yourself as a professional, there will be parts of this presentation that implicate our profession or your profession. This is not meant as an attack on any individual person. We are operating from an assumption and a belief that those of you, us, who have chosen a career of service to children and families have done this because you care deeply and you want to do your part to assure that all children and families thrive. We are just long overdue to face the truth of our history, take a hard look at what the data tells us about how the system impacts children and families, particularly those children and families of color, and for us to dedicate ourselves to considering how we can better design our systems to be more equitable and truly help families thrive. I want to also reiterate how we encourage self-care. If at any point this morning you feel triggered or you need a bio break or whatever it is you need to do to take care of yourself, we encourage you to do that. And we really welcome you to put your questions in the Q&A as we speak. If you don't feel your question was addressed during our presentation, there will be ample time to have it raised during the Q&A at the end. And now I would like to introduce my fellow panelist, Yahniie, so that she can tell you about herself.
Well, hello. My name is Yahniie, and I really just consider myself, but I consider myself a lived experience consultant because it doesn't matter what role I am in. I use my lived experience to help shape that role and make my role more effective. My background is I have lived experience with the child welfare system and also the juvenile justice system here in Los Angeles County. Also being a teen mom, that really helped kind of shape the way that I do advocacy and considering my family's history with the system as well. And I currently work as a bail disruptor with the Bail Project. However, I'm doing some work with the Youth Commission here in Los Angeles County, as well as some other roles that I sit in. So I'm going to pass it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Yahniie. And excuse me, everyone. Every day is a surprise when you have allergies. I'm Sarah Clifton. I use the pronoun she, her, hers. I am the Transition Age Youth Program Manager at the Alliance for Children's Rights. Same services that Mara did such a great job of explaining at Public Counsel, who is definitely one of our partner organizations that we do a lot of great work with. As she said, we are all very busy right now with many of the crises going on here in Los Angeles County. Today, I'm more here to speak about my own experiences as a parent's attorney and as a member of the Reimagine Child Safety Coalition in my individual capacity. So I will pass this on to Sabrina. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I too have a slightly raspy voice, so please bear with us. I'm getting over a cold. I'm Sabrina Forte. I am the Director of Policy and Impact Litigation at the Alliance for Children's Rights. So I have the honor of being one of Sarah's colleagues and work closely with Mara and her team at Public Counsel as well. You're going to hear a lot over the course of this presentation about the Alliance's policy work. So I'm not going to give a broad overview of what I do now because I think it will become more clear as we work through these slides. So I'm going to just dive in and share my screen. Let's see. Okay. Hopefully that works. Let me know if you can't see my screen and I'll just dive in. So this presentation is about the child welfare system and family regulation. We're going to talk about the history and the strategies for change. And I'm just going to walk through the objectives of this presentation. For the first 45 minutes to an hour or so, we're going to really dive into the history of America's child welfare system, its racist derivations and how it has evolved over time, intersecting at various points with race, class, gender, and then social policy and other legal systems, borrowing from the characteristics of other legal systems. And then at that point, I'll turn to Yahniie and Sarah to talk about the different approaches to addressing systemic racism and child welfare and talk about some of the different frameworks, the reform framework and then the abolitionist framework. And then I'll talk about some current policy issues that kind of illustrate that continuum between reform and abolition and how those reforms are being talked about in present day. And then we'll spend the latter part of the presentation doing more of a discussion, Q&A around practice tools for evaluating and challenging systemic inequities in our own work, in our own capacities, both as professionals and members of the society, where we're trying to make a shift from regulating and surveilling families to creating a society where all communities and families can thrive. I'm going to start with a very brief overview of California's juvenile dependency system, because I know that many of you know this system very well. And the theme across these next couple of slides is not to give you an exhaustive description of the juvenile dependency system, but really to illustrate all of the decision points and junctures where individual discretion and therefore individual and systemic bias can come into play and determine the futures of children and their parents and their broader families and communities. So many of you have seen this before, so I will go through it quickly. The statutory mission of the juvenile court is to provide for the protection and safety of children and the public, and importantly, to preserve and strengthen the family ties of children whenever possible, removing a child from their parents only when necessary. And if a child must be removed, to ensure that the child has as much of a normal upbringing as possible. So that's the statutory goal of the juvenile court. And we're going to talk at various points about whether the juvenile court system is fulfilling that mission. The stages of a dependency case start with a referral, and then, after an investigation, a removal by a police officer or a social worker upon substantiating a report of abuse or neglect. And shortly thereafter, there's a filing of a petition in juvenile dependency court alleging abuse or neglect in more specificity. The family then goes through a series of initial court hearings that can span from a month. In rare circumstances, they can get through all of the initial hearings in a month, but more frequently, it takes several months to determine whether abuse and neglect occurred as it was alleged by the social worker and the county, and then what is to happen to the child, assuming that the court has jurisdiction over them. If the child is placed in foster care, then the goal is reunification. So the court will order reunification services to the family with the goal of returning the child home as soon as possible and appropriate. And that can span from 6 months to 18 months, and sometimes more than that at the discretion of the court. It can also be cut short at the discretion of the court under certain circumstances. And then post-reunification, if reunification services do not result in a child's return home, services can be terminated, and then permanency planning can lead to a child either being placed in the long term with a family member, or guardianship, or the termination of parental rights and adoption. So it's there are many stages, and this flow chart does a nice job of illustrating, again, not going through this exhaustively, but illustrating all of the moments in time where the decisions made by individual social workers, social work supervisors, and judges can decide a child's future, their entire childhood and their adulthood after they leave the system. And that's a really sobering thing for those of us who work in or adjacent to the system to think about, that from the very beginning, a decision, a bias can determine the fate of an entire family and have ripple effects on a community. Many of you have seen this before. There are a number of bases for juvenile court jurisdiction to adjudicate a child a dependent, ranging from physical abuse to emotional abuse, no provision for support, severe physical abuse, or death of a sibling. But the vast majority of removals and placements in foster care are due to neglect. And I just copy pasted the first part of the California neglect statute. It's not even the entire statute, but the first part of the statute is copy pasted in very small print on this slide, just to show how overwhelming it is. And it encompasses a situation where a child has experienced harm as a result of a parent's failure or inability to provide supervision or protection, but it also includes when a child is at risk of harm, but hasn't been harmed yet. It includes willful decisions by the parent to not provide the child with basic necessities, but it also includes negligent failure or failure outside of a parent's control. And then there are carve-outs related to not removing children based on homelessness, not removing children based on a family's religious beliefs, but it's such a morass of a statute, and it doesn't align with other definitions of neglect in the penal code, in the mandatory reporting requirements, in the child protection hotline, that it becomes very unclear what neglect really is. And something that we'll talk about later in this presentation is that it often then gets confused with poverty. And so a lot of children are being removed and placed in foster care for reasons that are really hard to disentangle from poverty. Here are just some really quick numbers. There are 60,000 children in California's foster care system. That's an enormous number of children, and it's actually less than what existed in 20 years ago. There's been a decline in the number of children in California's foster care system, but it's still a huge population of kids who are separated from their parents by court order and in the custody of the state. 87% of those kids entered foster care based on a neglect allegation. So not, abuse, severe abuse, death of a sibling, and those other bases that are very serious, but constitute a very small number of children who are placed in foster care. And then a third of foster youth are placed with relatives or kinship caregivers, which reflects an increase over time in research and data illustrating the importance of family continuing to be involved in a child's life, even if a parent can't care for them, and importantly, helping children to maintain their community and cultural ties. I'm going to transition now to history and the roots of racism in child welfare, and then we'll come back to the present day. We don't have time to cover the entire complex history of racism and discrimination in the child welfare system, but it's important to review some historical realities and events that will deepen our understanding of why the system looks like it does today. And I can't proceed with this presentation without giving tremendous accolades to my colleague, David Noble, who spearheads the Alliance's policy work, really delving into this history, providing opportunities for child welfare stakeholders to confront this history, and then moving forward county and state level efforts to dismantle some of the inequities and disproportionalities in the system. So I can't claim these next few slides. This is really David's project, but I wanted to add that disclaimer, but I do think it's very important for us to have this conversation. So in thinking about how the US government has supported surveillance and control of Black families, we have to start with the institution of slavery, which arguably laid the foundation for the child welfare disparities we see today. Under slavery, enslaved parents had no right to their children, and enslaved children had no rights to their parents. Family members could be separated at a moment's notice, never to see each other again. It's also important to note the sexualized violence experienced by enslaved women, who, as a result of rape and forced breeding, were made to give birth to children who then became enslaved. And when I think about this history and its legacy today, I'm reminded of a TED Talk given by Bryan Stevenson, the famous civil rights lawyer. Bryan Stevenson runs the Equal Justice Initiative, which is working to end the use of the death penalty in the US, among other initiatives. And I highly recommend someday visiting the Peace and Justice Memorial that EJI created in Montgomery, Alabama, that is a memorial to victims of lynching in the American South. It's incredibly powerful and is grounded in this deeply held belief by Bryan Stevenson that it is incredibly important to confront our history so that we can move forward and build a more just society. But going back to the TED Talk, Stevenson describes a lecture he once gave in Germany where he was talking about his work with EJI. And after the lecture, a German woman stood up and said to him, "We could never have the death penalty in Germany. There's no way with our history that we could ever engage in the systemic killing of human beings." And this woman was, of course, referring to the Holocaust. And by no means do we bring up this anecdote to equate today's child welfare system to slavery, and certainly not to the Holocaust. But what we're arguing is that it's impossible to separate a country's troubling history from its present. And in addressing the racial disparities in child welfare today, there's an opportunity to right a historic wrong. In the latter stages of the 19th century, after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, there was a rapid increase in the number of orphanages around the country, in part to house children who were orphaned by the war. This was also the beginning of the era of legal segregation in the South, known as Jim Crow. And in the South and elsewhere in the US, most orphanages were segregated, and the orphanages that housed Black children tended to have fewer resources. It's probably not surprising to anyone. While we're discussing the roots of racism and child welfare, we also need to look at the government's deliberate and often successful attempts to subvert Native American cultural and family traditions by separating Native children from their families and sending them to boarding schools. Now, the first Indian boarding schools were founded in the 1860s by white men who saw it as their duty to civilize, scare quotes, Native children by teaching them English and converting them to Christianity. For the first decade of the Indian boarding school movement, the schools were located on tribal lands. But then in the 1880s, reformers decided that to truly assimilate Native children into mainstream white culture, it would be more effective to separate them from their families and place them in boarding schools off the reservations. In the quotation on this slide, journalist Mary Annette Pember describes what life was like for the tens of thousands of Native children who were sent to these institutions. Students were stripped of all things associated with Native life. Their long hair, a source of pride for many Native peoples, was cut short, usually into identical bowl haircuts. Students were physically punished for speaking their Native languages. Contact with family and community members was discouraged and forbidden altogether. The quote continues, survivors have described a culture of pervasive physical and sexual abuse at the schools. Food and medical attention were often scarce, and many students died. It wasn't until the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA, in 1978, which I'll discuss a little bit later, that Native parents were given the legal means to prevent their children from being unlawfully removed and sent to these schools or to other homes outside of their communities. It's important to discuss the Indian boarding school movement because, like slavery, it was actively supported by the federal government. So there's a system connection. This isn't just individual actors. It wasn't until the early 20th century that the federal government began to take a leading role in the more formal child welfare system that primarily served white families initially. Around this time, public opinion was turning against orphanages because they were seen as cold and overly institutional. At the 1909 White House Conference on the Care of Dependent Children, the attendees declared that children should not be removed from their homes except for urgent and compelling reasons, and destitution, or poverty, was not one of those reasons. This quote is significant because a group of child welfare experts more than a century ago were saying that it was wrong to separate children from their parents simply because a family was impoverished. And nevertheless, poverty is often one of the main reasons why children are separated from their parents today. During the Great Depression, the federal government created the Aid to Dependent Children program, later renamed Aid to Families with Dependent Children, or AFDC. This program provided direct cash aid to widowed mothers and single mothers living in poverty. While AFDC was mostly funded by the federal government, state agencies were in charge of administering those benefits. And in the Jim Crow South, welfare agencies created rules that allowed them to arbitrarily deny benefits to Black families. So welfare workers, for example, would deem a household unsuitable for AFDC if the worker determined that the children had been born out of wedlock or that a man who was not the children's parent was living in the home. And in 1960, in what became known as the Louisiana incident, the state of Louisiana expelled 23,000 children from its welfare rolls based on the judgment that their households were unsuitable. Most of these children were Black. And there was a public outcry following this Louisiana incident, after which the federal government instituted a rule that states could not deny benefits or services to families simply based on the subjective judgment that their household was unsuitable. This rule was named the Fleming Rule after Arthur Fleming, the secretary of the department that administered AFDC. And after the institution of the Fleming Rule, an increasing number of Black mothers were able to receive welfare benefits. So the Fleming Rule reduced some of the discrimination in the administration of welfare benefits, but it was the first in a series of policy reforms during the 1960s that led to more children of color being placed in foster care. According to the Fleming Rule and subsequent federal policy changes, state child welfare agencies could no longer ignore the needs of children living in neglectful or abusive households. Instead, welfare workers had to either provide services that would allow children to remain safely in the home or recommend that children be removed from home and placed in foster care. For the first time, states received federal funds to place children in foster care and provide benefits and services to foster caregivers. On the other hand, states were not reimbursed for providing in-home services to birth parents to alleviate the circumstances of alleged neglect or abuse. In other words, there was and continues to be a financial incentive for agencies to remove children and place them in foster care. Under the new federal policies, states were also required by law to report neglectful or abusive parents to the child welfare and court system. These developments, emphasizing the removal of children and reporting parents to the courts, were significant because those elements of the child welfare process remain disproportionately harmful to children and families of color today, even though those practices are theoretically aimed at protecting children. Okay, so now we're into the 1970s. In 1974, Congress passed the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1974, also known as CAPTA, which many of you have probably heard of. CAPTA made it so that states had to follow certain guidelines for mandatory reporting in order to receive federal funding to address child abuse. In the years after the passage of CAPTA, most states widened the net of mandatory reporters from healthcare workers to teachers, social workers, and law enforcement. Not surprisingly, the number of child maltreatment reports skyrocketed. Between 1974 and 1980, the number of maltreatment reports nationwide rose from 60,000 to 1.1 million. And the number of foster care placements rose as well. But the federal and state governments didn't view the increase in maltreatment reports and foster care placements as a reason to invest more resources and in preventative services and supports, or services to stabilize families so that children could remain safely in their home. Another notable and important piece of child welfare legislation passed in the 1970s was ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, which I alluded to before. During congressional testimony, it was revealed that between 25 and 35% of Native children in the country were being separated from their parents and placed outside of their families and communities by child welfare agencies. 80% of these children were being placed in white households without consideration as to possible foster care placements within their community. Many of these children were removed from their homes simply because their families were living in poverty. ICWA was designed to create strong legal safeguards against the needless separation of Native families and all the related traumas. Broadly speaking, and there are many components to ICWA, ICWA stipulates that tribal courts are best situated to make child welfare decisions involving Native children, and that child welfare agencies must make what are known as active efforts. So you may have heard of reasonable efforts in the state child welfare system. Under ICWA, active efforts are required to keep Native families together and place Native children with relatives or other community members. And with the passage of ICWA, Native parents won the legal right to prevent their children from being placed in off-reservation boarding schools. These last two pieces of federal legislation, the bullet points at the end of this slide, the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act of 1980 and ASFA, which you probably all know, the Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997, both made it easier for courts to terminate parents' rights on a faster timeline and make children eligible for adoption. These were changes that were made around the time that more and more Black children were entering foster care as a result of the over-policing and over-incarceration that characterized the war on drugs. So fast forwarding a bit to today, racial disproportionality and disparities today reveal in the data some distressing statistics. To clarify terminology, Disproportionality refers to a group's overrepresentation within the base population, here the child welfare population, compared to their share of the overall child's population. And disparity refers to a difference in outcome at a certain stage of the child welfare process. So for example, Black children who are alleged to have been neglected or abused by their parent or caregiver are more likely to have that allegation substantiated by a child welfare agency than white children are. I'll discuss that specific disparity in more detail later, but let's just look at the data. In the US, Black children comprise 14% of all children in the population, but 23% of children in foster care. And more than half of Black children in the US experience a child welfare investigation before the age of 18, half. Despite the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act more than 40 years ago, the proportion of Native American children in foster care is also disproportionate, 2.6 times higher than their share of the total child's population. And while Latino children are underrepresented in the national foster care population, they're overrepresented in more than 20 states, including California. And they represent the largest, just by gross numbers, population in foster care. Looking at the back end of the system, meaning how children leave foster care, children of color are less likely than white children to reunify with their family or to exit to other permanency options like adoption or legal guardianship. So this is particularly concerning because children who age out of foster care without permanency are more likely to end up experiencing homelessness or incarceration and other outcomes that are derivative of a lack of permanency. In California, Black children are nearly 3 times as likely as white children to be referred for maltreatment, more than 3 times as likely to have a maltreatment allegation substantiated, and 4 times as likely to enter care. So there's kind of an increasing level of disproportionality at different stages of the process. Compared to white children, Native American children in California are more than twice as likely to be referred for maltreatment, 2.5 times as likely to have a maltreatment allegation substantiated, and more than 3 times as likely to enter foster care. So again, increasing disproportionalities at each stage of the process that can't simply be answered by the fact that circumstances of maltreatment are more prevalent in a particular population. So how can we make sense of all of the data that I just threw at you? To start with, as I mentioned earlier, when discussing the first era of federal child welfare policies, poverty is the most significant risk factor for child welfare involvement by far. The formal child welfare system was built to support needy children and their families. And certain communities of color experience much higher rates of poverty than their white peers because of much of the history that I talked about before. It's impossible to separate that history from any system that has been built up over time by the United States. According to a 2020 report by the Children's Defense Fund, here are the child poverty rates in America. 30.1% for Black children, 29.1% for Native American children, 23.7% for Hispanic children, and 8.9% for white children. So children belonging to groups that experience poverty at 2 to 3 times the rate of white children are more subject to child welfare involvement as a result of symptoms of that poverty. Most of us know, I hope all of us know, that income and wealth inequality in this country is not an accident. For centuries, our federal, state, and local governments have enacted laws and policies that have restricted opportunities for employment and educational attainment for communities of color. And that's not to mention inequities in healthcare access, housing, public safety, and many other areas. But are the disproportionate impacts of poverty the sole explanation for the racial inequities in child welfare? Probably not. Even before low-income families of color come into contact with child welfare, they're under surveillance of professionals in other systems, social services, healthcare, education, the criminal legal system. And those people are mandated by law to report suspicions of child abuse and neglect using very ambiguous criteria. And racism and bias in those systems feed directly into the disparities in the child welfare system. So let's consider what we know about racism in policing and the criminal legal system. Between 1986 and 1991, at the height of the crack cocaine epidemic, the number of Black women incarcerated for drug offenses rose 828%. In a 5-year period, the number of Black women imprisoned for mostly non-violent drug offenses jumped more than 800%. Based on the recent data, it's fair to assume that around a third of these women were mothers and the primary caretakers for their children. So as a direct result of over-policing and incarceration, tens of thousands of Black children ended up in foster care. And this phenomenon continues today, though to a less severe degree. This is a moment to stop and think about the historical pattern of devaluing the Black family and Black motherhood, slavery and family separation, Black families being arbitrarily denied welfare benefits. And then in the latter half of the 20th century, the criminal justice system and the child welfare system combining to separate Black families rather than provide them with support, whether in the form of substance abuse treatment or other supports. Putting aside the inequities in other systems, when low-income families of color are investigated for neglect or abuse, decades of research and personal testimony show that the child welfare system treats families of colors differently from white families. In other words, biases held by people working within the system show up in their decision-making. A 2008 study looking at data from Texas found that after controlling for both income and risk, Black children were 77% more likely than white children to be removed instead of receiving services in the home. In other words, caseworkers determined that a white child and a Black child were at equal risk of future maltreatment, but in exercising their discretion, were more likely to remove the Black child. And that's why I provided that flow chart in the beginning and talking about the child welfare system, because those biases can be compounded at each stage in which those decisions are made. So before I wrap up this section on poverty and the child welfare system, I want to discuss some of the implications of federal policies on poverty rates as well as child maltreatment. Prior to joining the Alliance for Children's Rights, I spent several years working as a legal aid attorney. And so the social safety net is so core to what I believe would allow families and children to thrive. And it's really important to talk about the shrinking of that safety net over our history. In the first section of this training, I talked about AFDC, the Federal Cash Assistance Program. During the 1960s, thanks in part to the welfare rights movement, a growing number of Black families were able to receive these benefits. Around this same time, though, a conservative backlash against anti-poverty programs such as AFDC began to grow. The campaign to dismantle AFDC culminated with President Bill Clinton's 1996 welfare reform bill. This bill eliminated AFDC, which was an entitlement program, and replaced it with Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, or TANF, which is a block grant. The funding level for TANF has been frozen since 1987, which means that its value in inflation-adjusted dollars has shrunk 40%. Under TANF, states can impose work requirements to limit eligibility for benefits. And today, Black children are more likely to live in states, many of them in the South, where TANF has all but disappeared, meaning that less than 10% of low-income families receive benefits. Compare that to the 1970s, when over 80% of poor families with children received AFDC benefits. And I will say, as a policy advocate, that California is not an outlier. It's certainly better in implementing TANF, also known as CalWORKs in California, but it requires tremendous political pressure and political will to add flexibilities to some of the timelines and work requirements in the CalWORKs program. Just yesterday, one such flexibility was removed from a bill after political pressure and stigma against the CalWORKs program. I won't talk about that too much in detail, but it's definitely something where our state is more like the rest of the country than we'd like to admit. Compare what's happened with TANF to the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC. A study published this year by researchers at the University of Washington found that a 10% increase in the state version of the EITC for low to moderate income working families led to a 9% drop in the annual number of child maltreatment referrals to child welfare agencies over a 14-year period. As EITC benefits rose, depending on state policy changes, maltreatment reports, and specifically neglect reports, declined. What this study and the data on TANF really underlie is that this country makes deliberate political decisions that can allow families to languish in poverty and can also increase the risk of child maltreatment. So to summarize, there are some key observations coming out of confronting the history of racism in America and in the systems that have been developed by the federal government and implemented by state and local entities. The child welfare system is rooted in racist assumptions of who is fit to parent, or to take the terminology used in the early years of the AFDC program, who is suitable to parent or unsuitable to parent. The child welfare system has emerged to many as a system of last resort for children experiencing poverty and homelessness when other safety net programs fail. So when TANF is underfunded, when Medicaid is underfunded, when there are inadequate resources or infrastructure for mental health programs, when there's inadequate access to substance abuse treatment or housing, then often mandated reporters feel like they have no choice but to call the CPS hotline in order to find some way for a child and family to get help. And that's a symptom of racism and neglect across multiple systems. And then lastly, family separation is a direct and collateral consequence of over-policing and mass incarceration. So even though we're talking about child welfare today, and I think that Yahniie is going to underscore this when I turn to her in a moment, we can't separate reform of the child welfare system from reform of all of the other systems that have been built to disenfranchise populations of color over the last several centuries. So with that, we can all take a deep breath. And I am going to pass the baton to Yahniie.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I think we're going to bounce off of Tamara as well.
Yes, thank you. Do you want to begin, Yahniie, or you want me to start our dialogue?
Sure. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in, and then you can take it from there. So thank you, Sabrina, for all of that context. This actually is new to me to actually see the policies that had an impact on my family story, right? And so thank you for beautifully articulating what that looked like for us. And so anyways, my experience was I went into foster care at like 4 years old, a few weeks before kindergarten. And I remember being raised as a single, as the only child. However, my mother was 18 when she had me, and I was her fourth child. But two of them had already been, my older brother and sister had already been in the system. If we could just go to the next slide, and if folks can see that really quick, because I did want to just bring that up. Is it up?
Sabrina, are you able to share? There you go.
Okay, there she is. And then the next slide. So these are some photos of my family. This is literally to the left is literally the only family photo we have. Those are my two older siblings. And then the oldest one, she was with her father. But when I was raised by my mother, who's there in the picture, I was the only child. I had a beautiful life. I just had so many beautiful memories. And one day law enforcement came to pick me up. That's me in the middle at the bottom right there with the big cheeks. My cheeks are still the same. So one day law enforcement came to pick me up. I was a few days before kindergarten. My mom was crying, and I asked her, what's going on? And she said nothing. And then all I know is that I didn't see my mom for a very, very long time. Nobody explained anything that happened. I know that once I got into the system, I was severely abused. And when I was taken away from her, I found out later that I was taken away for general neglect or for suspected neglect, right? And so when someone called law enforcement, they came out, this had nothing to do with my mother and her cases or anything. Literally had nothing to do with me. It had something to do with her roommate. But because she had a history, she was a foster youth in the system. She had to take care of herself since 11 years old. She went into foster care at about 14 when she had my oldest sister, because her mother was struggling with addiction. And so when she went into care, there were no resources for her. They said that they wanted to reunify the family, but my mom was living in Long Beach at the time, taking the bus to West LA, 3-4 hour trips, going to parenting classes. She finished her parenting classes, and right when she got to court, they would ask her to do additional things. She had no support. So my older siblings ended up getting taken away. In addition to that, she was dealing with a domestic violence relationship with my father. For example, she fought to get my older sister back, who's there to the left in the photo. She fought to get her back, did all of the court requirements. And when my older brother was a few months old, my dad and her, there was a physical altercation where he attacked her, and then some community members helped protect her in that moment. And then there was some gang stuff going on, and my dad came back with his friends, and they ended up shooting up the apartments that she was in. So then my paternal grandmother then called DCFS and reported her, right? And so this is a family conflict that was dangerous, but no one ever protected my mother in that situation. And when they called on her, they said that she was involved in a gang dispute, as opposed to saying that she was involved in a domestic violence relationship and she was trying to protect her children, but this man was harming her, right? And so fast forward, I grew up in the system. I'm severely abused and neglected, and there were several reports. They never considered sending me back to my mother, and never really provided resources for me to work through those things. So I grew up as a teenager very angry. I got in a fight in high school, ended up in the juvenile justice system for a fight on school campus. And after that, I started to kind of see what that I was hurt. I started to understand why I was so angry because of the things that had happened to me in care. And nobody ever asked me if I wanted to go home, if that was the safest place for me, which it was, because they placed me with all of these strangers who did all of these things. So I'm gonna pass it back to Mara because I think there's some more questions.
Okay, thank you, Yahniie. I just want to tell you and everyone listening today what an absolute privilege and honor it is to be here with you and to have walked beside you on this journey. We've known each other over a decade. And we put together a couple of questions. Some of them you've already begun to touch on. Let's talk about when we first connected, and if you can describe your experience as a teenager in foster care, in placement, who became pregnant, and from the beginning to moving forward.
Yeah, I think honestly, so I was never a dual youth, which in LA County, a dual youth is a young person who's on both probation and also involved in as a foster youth. So I was never in that position. I was either a foster youth or I was a probation youth. So I got pregnant at 17, and I was on probation at the time. My probation officer did not like me. I asked him for resources. I asked him, I need housing, but instead he closed my case, right? So he closed my case knowing I was homeless, I was pregnant, and I had nowhere to go. And so I had no choice but to contact DCFS and ask for support. At this time, the social worker said to me that if you weren't pregnant, we wouldn't help you. Right. So that what my mom told me that meant was if you basically, they're looking to take your child, right? And I was just like, okay, you're just being paranoid, right? And but this came out of a social worker's mouth that they wouldn't have helped me if I wasn't pregnant. And so I ended up at St. Anne's, and that's where I met Mara. I was very, very angry. I was tired of going through all of these systems. And I remember Mara coming in, or she had called and left me a note there, and it said a social worker. And I remember returning the call, like, what do you want, right? What do you want? Another one, you want to take my baby too, right? And she's like, I just want to clarify that I do not work for DCFS, right? And I was like, okay, but you're a social worker. So what, and then she had to clarify that a few more times before I began to trust her. But what made the relationship between Mara and I so special was that she came into the space and she saw me as a human. I have a long history with the system, right? And a lot of people read these reports and they determine who you are before they even walk into the room. But that is not something that happened between us. In fact, I had already been through enough, and I felt like I just needed to do what I needed to do to make sure that when this child comes into our life or into my life, that I'm able to care for it. So in my mind, as a young person, I'm like, I need to get my GED. I need to get a job. I need to get housing. I need to do these things. And then you had all of these systems in place that were saying, no, you need to do it this way. And all of these people, maybe in my family or whatever, that were saying, no, you need to do it this way. And I'm just like, I am just trying to make sure that this child survives, right? And nobody was listening, but Mara made sure to come in, and public counsel made sure to provide me with the supports that I needed. For example, I was going to a school at St. Anne's that was not accredited, right? And I was like, I am not getting these good grades and wasting my time because my high school diploma is not going to mean anything. I need to go to trade tech and just get my GED. This is a waste of my time. So what St. Anne's ended up doing, which I didn't know that was against their policy, but was that they stopped paying me. So what they were incentivizing all the girls to go to school by paying them like $5 a day or whatever, right? And when I stopped going to the school that they wanted me to go to, they stopped paying me to go to school altogether. But I was like, I don't care because I'm focused on the future, right? But when public counsel became involved, not only were they not paying me, but they were aiming to take my child based on my history with the child welfare system and my history of probation. So that is what my pregnancy experience was like. It was very unstable and it was very tumultuous emotionally.
Wow. Even though I know your story, Yahniie, I look at you and I say, this is a survivor against all odds. When you and I were preparing for this dialogue, you said, I want to tell people what it looks like to be an ally. I want them to know, what they can do, how they can conduct themselves. Why did you move from angry to trusting when I was yet another social worker, let alone a white one? What do people need to know to be an ally that young people or any families impacted by the system are going to be open to working with?
I think one of the things is to, of course, build a rapport. As I mentioned, when you came in, I just was like, hell no, not another one, right? And excuse my language, y'all. But that's really what it was. And I think that you clarifying your role as non-DCFS was really important. However, I understand that there's maybe some folks here that do work for the county or work for the city or work in these official positions. But I think what's super, super, super important is that folks are honest. Like, even if you disagree with a policy, you say, you're just very raw about it. Now, you don't have to put yourself on the line, but you let them know, like, this is unfair. This may be unfair, but this is what I can do to support you. You know what I mean? Because a lot of the time, people who work in the system are gaslighting us. So we know that these things exist, right? So the policies actually exist that are racist, right? And then we feel it because we literally have to deal with and I'm going to call it the kidnapping of our children, right? We have to deal with the kidnapping of our children. We have to deal with being wrongfully incarcerated. We have to deal with all of these things. And we feel like, it feels like everything is closing in on you. But then when you have someone who is working for the same system that we know is terrorizing us, and they're saying, no, this is the right way, right? That is gaslighting us, right? And so I think that just being honest and about what you do and don't agree with on some level, or even if you can't be fully honest, you say, listen, I understand how you feel. This is what I can do to support you, right? I think that's one thing. But also understand, if you all met me based on paperwork, you probably wouldn't feel safe around me, right? And so if you met me based on what was black and white, you probably would not feel safe or would not want to be around me. And so I think that it's super important to really walk into a space and connect with the human that is in the space, because you don't know what folks are going through, and you don't know anything about the context that led to that black and white. If that makes sense.
Wow. So what I heard was clarify your role. Even if you are working within a system that is imperfect. And I want to clarify too, I partner quite a bit with DCFS. That's how I was fortunate to connect with you. So as I said up front, this is not an indictment of any individuals, including those who work at DCFS. But what you're telling us is, wherever you work, really be clear and upfront about, this is who I am. This is what my boundaries are. This is what I can do and can't do for you. And to maybe step outside the line a little bit and say, and honestly, I'm with you that this barrier here that's preventing us from doing what we both know would help you more here is messed up. But my hands are tied because these are the policies of the environment I work in. So empathy, that's what you're saying.
Empathy and just making sure that you listen to the voices that are talking, that are speaking, because everything that we know is, as we can see from the slides that Sabrina showed us, right? Everything that we learned about how the system works is wrong, right? And so when we talk about what it means to be an ally, it means really being creative. I think that's one thing about Mara and other allies that really made a change in my life, right? Really being creative. I had a probation officer when I was incarcerated, the most incredible probation officer on the planet, right? This man exposed me to all types of mindfulness exercises. And instead of, when I would get a write-up for being defiant or being running my own program or however that works, he would make me write about it. He would make me write about why I did these things, right? He was very, very creative about how to get me to really tap into why I was even incarcerated in the first place, right? And that helped change my life, right? And then in addition to that, so this is coloring outside the lines, what he also did was get me into a boarding school in Colorado. He got me an interview for this school. So we applied, I wrote the essay, and he was like, listen, your interview is in a few months, you're gonna get out. He got me an early release from juvenile camp. And then he was like, you're gonna be going to Colorado. This is the process, this is what the process looks like. And they're gonna interview you. And he wasn't supposed to do that. Technically, he could have got in trouble for that, right? And that was something that I needed, right? That was something that I absolutely needed because I didn't have family support. My family still had not recovered from incarceration and my mom being in the system and having her children taken from her every opportunity that people got, right? And so we didn't have that tight knit, and she didn't heal from the things that she needed to heal from for me to have that family support. And this is what I needed. He found a solution for that, right? And so those are the types of things, like even Mara, 2 days after my baby was born, I was at St. Anne's, and because I didn't feel safe going into a particular room at St. Anne's, my first mandated call, or the first report that I had, the first mandated report I had, was because I didn't take my daughter into a room that was freshly painted, right? That same day that I came home from the hospital, I refused to go in there. So they called DCFS and said I was endangering my child. And the social worker on the phone, and they had a social worker or someone sitting there watching me. It's called 101. They were sitting there next to at my door as if I was suicidal, right? And they said that I put my daughter in danger. And I said, I spoke with the social worker and I said, if you can put it in writing if you can put it in writing, you know, that I have to go into this room, that is the only way that I would potentially go into the room, but I'm still not taking my daughter in there with those fumes like that, you know? And so, and the social worker was like, well, y'all need to figure it out because I'm not coming down there. And I was like, there we are. There we are. But anyways, I digress.
You're just painting a very real life picture of all the, of what Sabrina presented to us in the abstract, that it's just this constant push to defend yourself as a competent parent in obscene scenarios. So, you know, I'm sorry you have so many examples to share. So the other things I'm hearing you say about making a good ally is finding opportunities and go that extra mile to make sure those opportunities are really accessible. And instead of using labels like resistant and defiant, think about tools and strategies you can give those you work with to manage this very valid frustration they're experiencing. So,
absolutely.
Anything more you want to add as we're talking about tools for allyship?
No, I didn't get to my point, actually. The point was when my daughter was 12 days old, Mara actually found me housing. So that was my first apartment came through Mara. She had a friend who was now starting a transition program, and I moved into that place. And because of that, that was an extra layer of safety and stress, a stress relief for us as a family. But allyship, I think, no, just if there's something in place, okay, this is how I look at it. When I see something in the media that is calling a group of folks dangerous or that uses very strong derogatory language, I always question it. Always question who is involved. Why are they being called dangerous? What does that look like? Because that typically, when that type of language is used, it's usually people from my community, and it's usually a deeper story. But when it's in black and white, it looks different and it feels different when you're reading it. So question everything.
Question everything, and don't make decisions about things you hear and read. Make a decision based on your interaction with the folks you're working with as a human. Yeah. Okay. I'm sure we could do another 5 hours on this because you have so much wisdom around this, but you asked me to pose a few other questions to you. So trying to decide which branch I want to go down. They're sort of intertwined. You wanted to talk about the intergenerational aspect of entry into the system and how it's just recently you're developing all of this empathy for your mother, having all of these light bulbs about how alone she was and how unsupported she was and how no wonder it happened to you. And I want to know if there's anything more you want to add about the intergenerational aspect, and then take that into your recent experience as an adult parent and the police getting involved in your own life and the impact on your beautiful daughter.
Yeah, so when I was 18, after having all of this system experience, I decided to move into advocacy work because of just how much the system had hurt me, and how much even my peers have been hurt by the system. And I was just like, we got to change it. And we have the power to do that. So fast forward a few years ago, and a few days before Christmas, 2019, LAPD knocked on my door and asked to come in. And I said no. And they proceeded to push and force my door in. Mind you, I said no because, for one, they didn't announce why they were there. And you don't just ask somebody to come in their house and I'm undressed, right? And so there were two things happening at the time. My daughter and I were headed to a toy drive, and this led to my incarceration. And this experience was incredibly traumatizing, and very, very scary because nobody even, in my eyes, usually when you contact the police, you usually let your family or your community know. Nobody knew that the police were in my house and that this was happening. And luckily, my daughter was able to contact some of our community members and family members to let them know what was happening. However, basically that led to my arrest. That led to my daughter's detention. And literally the LAPD falsified charges. And then their focus was to, one, get me fired, because I was crying and begging them, asking them, you know, I'm a case manager. What are you guys doing? Like, why are you guys doing this? Why are you arresting me? And what's going on? So they're looking for reasons to arrest me. They're trying to find me because they knew that they didn't have a warrant to kick in my door in the first place. They didn't have a warrant to be there. And then they built this case. And my daughter ended up being taken, and that was intentional. And what they told the caregivers was that if I would have called them sir or ma'am, none of this would have happened. And my thing is, I didn't break a law. I didn't violate anything, but you guys arrested me over respectability politics and took my daughter, right, over this. And there is literally a social worker. There was literally a social worker there on site that they called their partner, that they literally said, we're going to take your baby. And I said, well, you're going to have to prove that I'm an unfit parent. And they said, okay, we will. And they proceeded to write a creative report, and they did what they did. And so and they had her on call. So they said her name. They said, call Jeanette. That was her name. And they called her, and she did what she did. So I say all that to say that in that experience, I was really, first of all, what happened to me was over 20 years prior. And I know, you know, what it feels like to have your child to be kidnapped, right? Legally. And they knew that they falsified charges. There's nothing that we can do about it, right? Aside from do policy advocacy to change how this works, right? To change the fact that they are not held accountable for when they lie. And I looked at the fact that I was able to call Mara. I was able to call, there's someone in this as a participant here that I was able to call that supported me through this process. And there was a whole entire community, pretty much LA really came out and really supported me and Naima through this process, which made it a little bit easier. And then I thought back to my mom, right? Having the same thing happen to her. And who did she have to call? She couldn't even call family because of the shame around her being a teen parent so early, and the shame around her mother being addicted to crack. And I really thought about the fact that there are so many people, because of how comfortable law enforcement was and how comfortable that social worker was with lying and doing what they did to violate us. I was like, there has to be more parents that are going through this who cannot call anybody, who can do nothing but sit there and cry. And so we have to change this. This is terrible.
Oh, I don't know how many times I can apologize for the ugly, but never enough. Can we take a quick break? Sabrina, can you flash the picture so everyone can see how beautiful her Naima is? And the picture, the slide with the whole family.
So on the left, of course, yes. So to the right is my mom and my daughter. You see they're about the same height. And then that is on the bottom left or the bottom right there, that is my daughter and I.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, what were you gonna say?
I was gonna ask you to do a little bragging. Let's hear what grade she's in, all the art she loves to do.
Yeah, Naima is 11 years old, about to be 12. She's practicing dance, she's in band, she's on honor roll, and she is incredible. And the best thing that ever happened to me. So as a teen parent, I'm really proud of her. I'm proud of us for fighting through this together. I really, as a mother, you know, none of us are ever perfect, but one thing about me is I believe in what I call collaborative parenting, where I want her to participate in her being raised, because I believe in youth voice, and I know how strong I was when I was a young person. And I believe that they have a right to participate in how they're being raised. So I love my baby to death. That is my best friend.
And she, I can vouch, she's really spectacular. And I know you've taken her on some camping, youth leadership activities. So we definitely have another leader on our hands here.
Yeah, her first time speaking and advocating for herself was this past Monday at the Reimagine Child Safety rally, where she was able to speak. And I actually had to read it for her because it was, as you can imagine, it was very emotional. But she really wanted to make sure that the Board of Supervisors heard what happened to her from her. And that was, she never had a chance. She never, and oftentimes the families do not have a voice in the system. So when Sabrina mentioned all of these court dates that happen and these jurisdiction hearings and the detention hearings, the parent never had a voice. That judge sat there in that courtroom, and there are some people who are present here that were in the courtroom at the time, and she called me a monster based on the reports. She called me, she said so many things about me based on this report, and she was so angry that she had to return my child after having detained her for 6 days. She was so angry for having to return her so early because there was no case. But this is what happens. There is no voice for people and families. Once the social workers have a voice, and once LAPD, because they're under oath, that is law. And that's what we have to change.
Well, I think you've made that entirely clear. I have one more question we prepared, but before I go there, is there anything else you want to add?
No.
Okay. We decided we'd wrap up by saying, if you wanted the participants in this webinar to remember only one thing from today, what would that be? Do you remember what you told me?
It's a couple different things, but for sure, it does go back to the title. It goes back to the theme of these conversations, which is just because it's legal doesn't make it ethical, doesn't make it right. It doesn't mean that you're keeping kids safe. I went into the system. I was safe at home. When I went into the system, that is when the dangerous things happened to me. You know, that is when the severe abuse happened. That is when the things happen that I still have to heal from, right, and heal through. And I just also want to add that, you know, on Monday, I called my mom when the Board of Supervisors approved the pre-child counsel, making sure that parents have counsel before they even hit the courtroom as soon as the investigation is open. Because my mom was essentially my lawyer throughout that process, and she had nobody when she was going through the process. And she was very, very emotional, and she's very much involved now, where she used to be disconnected from this work. But I told her that my story is your story. And I needed to repeat it to her a couple times for her to understand I don't do this work for nothing. This system tore my family apart, and we have to take in this generation and put it back together. And we don't have a booklet, a manual, or anything to do that. But if these things happen to you, it's not going to happen in vain as long as I'm alive. And I said, not on my watch. It's really not going to happen on my watch. We're going to do everything in our power to break this down.
Thank you, Yahniie. So yeah, the title of today is very well chosen. Just because it's legal doesn't make it ethical. And this is a perfect time to take me off, put you and Sarah on to talk about this policy and the Reimagine Child Safety Coalition. And so I'll switch places, and I want to thank you so much for your vulnerability and your advocacy and just allowing me to be part of your life. Go ahead, Sarah.
Everyone. So thank you so much, Mara and Yahniie and Sabrina, for all of that setup. I think that it really leads well into these next parts. As somebody who was a parents attorney at Los Angeles Dependency Lawyer during part of my career, as well as working with transition age youth now, I can really speak on, seeing firsthand or secondhand in some ways, the things that, the history that led us to where we are now that Sabrina presented for everyone, and just the things that were just shared by Yahniie. So we're going to talk a little bit about frameworks for change, reform versus abolition. Sabrina, can everybody see me okay? Okay, so we're going to begin with reform. And there's also some terms I just want to talk about too. You'll hear people sometimes refer to the child welfare system as the family regulation system, because a lot of people don't really believe that the system is acting in the best welfare for children, and that it's really more about the over-policing and the regulating of families, like you've heard earlier today. So when we talk about reform, this approach aims to build upon and improve existing policies and practices, often by increasing funding for and expanding reach of the system. So when you're talking about reform, people are still believing that the system in its current state can work, but what they want is to improve the system and to create reforms to it, to make it work better and more effective. Some of the ways that they've tried to reform the system, and you may have seen some of these things in the newspaper over the past year, because there has been a lot more attention on this. And so blind removals is something that some other states had started to do pilot systems on. And we're finding that there was a significant statistical drop in how many Black families and Brown and Indigenous families were actually seeing children removed when the people that were doing those removals didn't see what their race was, what their ethnicity was. So it was really remarkable to see, even just that small change of not knowing that the file you're looking at is a Black mother and Black children, and that they didn't see the need for the children to be removed without having that information. So I think that really plays upon unconscious biases, even things that people really don't recognize they're doing, but because of those unconscious biases, when they were seeing that it was a Black person in the file, they were more likely to remove. So that's something that LA County wants to also implement here, and looking at the success that it's had in other states. And so you may have seen stuff in the newspapers about that. Also improving training for mandated reporters. The over-reporting, the over-policing, it is difficult when social workers have this training, and when you're a mandated reporter and there's just certain things that, you have to report, but there's other things that are discretionary, and also just the importance of accurate reporting and not exaggerating situations. Flexibilities to encourage placement with family members in foster care. So with that one, there's just more push for reform and not removing kids and placing them into foster care, but allowing them to actually be with family members. A lot of times family members were not able to have their, nieces or nephews or whatever the relation might be placed in their home, maybe because of a really old thing on their record, going back over 20 years, and they've never had any other criminal record whatsoever besides that. And there's pushes to, continue to remove some of those barriers and make reforms to, those laws that were so black and white and so stringent that were keeping families separated and forcing children into foster care with strangers and into bad situations that further traumatize them. So you can go to the next slide. Child welfare system. Now we're going to talk about the abolition. So this is from the Upend movement. Abolition requires ending this oppressive system and imagining and recreating the ways in which society supports children, families, and communities in being safe and thriving. And I'm not sure if you guys can see me. I only see Mara's name on the screen. I'm not sure if I'm being spotlighted so you can see.
I can see you and you're spotlighted on mine. So
okay, perfect. Thank you. So you can see I'm also wearing some of the Reimagine Child Safety shirt that I got at the rally on Tuesday. And, you know, our coalition is not an abolitionist coalition, but I would say that a large number of the members are personally and individually abolitionists. You know, some of the organizations that signed on, maybe the individual member is an abolitionist, but maybe their organization isn't an abolitionist. So we do have a mix of abolitionists and reformists and people who are kind of caught in this middle place. So some things about abolition that you see listed here are: do not remove Black children, invest in Black neighborhoods, period. That's it. You know, full stop, just do not remove them. Remove mandatory reporting requirements, create community pathways for intervention, provide temporary and long-term custody options outside of child welfare for relative and community care of children. And these are a lot of the things that, you know, we are focused on. It's not about putting more money into the child welfare system. It's about taking that money and reinvesting it into communities and focusing at the earlier points where people need support and services and they need the help and support of their community, so that they don't end up having the police come in, so that they don't end up having DCFS come in, so that they don't get to a place where they're unsupported and frustrated and have no other resources, that they end up in the child welfare system. So, you know, a lot of people, I think when you're talking about reform, they're talking about changing a system that they think is broken. But I think when you're talking about abolitionists, you're talking about, we don't believe the system's broken. We believe the system is operating just as it was meant to and just as it was set up to operate. And so it's not about trying to reform a system that's operating just as it was intended. It's about abolishing that system and starting over and imagining and reimagining something that works for children and works for families and keeps them safe. And it's certainly not about, you know, the salacious stories that the media picks up. No one wants to see children hurt. No one wants to see, you know, children hospitalized, children killed, not by their parents, also not by their foster parents, because we've also seen stories where children were taken from their families for honestly not good reasons, put into foster care, and then, you know, beaten so badly that they end up in a coma in the hospital. So you can see those horrible stories happening on both ends. But what you don't really see are a lot of the stories that don't go to the media about the trauma that children do suffer in foster care. And their stories are often never heard. You know, Yahniie, do you want to say anything else about that, please?
Jump in for sure on that. A lot of people will believe that, you know, they were removed from this terrible home, right? They were removed from this terrible home for this neglect or this abuse or suspected whatever. And now they're safe, now that they're in the system because the system protected them. However, I know more stories, more horror stories for people, for my peers, than I do know of successful placements. And oftentimes, it, like what you guys saw was a photo, the only family photo that we have, because all of us were in the system. My mom doesn't have any memory. She missed kindergarten, right? She still is broken about that today. And so when you are disconnecting these children from their families, they didn't place me with a family member, they placed me with strangers who left me to sleep outside overnight as a 7-year-old, as a 6-year-old, right? In my underwear, right? And so these are the things that are happening to kids that don't get reported, that don't get news footage. And that's a light story, right? That's a light story, but yeah.
And, you know, once a lot of these families are in the system, it's very difficult to get out of the system and to not have the system constantly tracking you and surveying your family. And so, you know, when I was a parent's attorney, you know, you have clients who maybe they've had 7 children, and with every single child, they've ended up with DCFS involvement, with dependency court cases. And even if they've come a really far place in their life. They've gotten hold of, maybe they had addiction issues and they're far past that. They've been sober for years. They've turned their whole life around. And even then, they don't often even get a chance, to raise, a newborn child, because they're only focused on looking at their past and not looking at their present and their future. And it just makes it even harder to ever move on once you're in the system. And some of the posters I have behind me are also from the coalition, Stop Punishing Families for Poverty, because in so many cases, that's what it is. It's not an issue of a parent not loving their child. It's not an issue of a parent willfully neglecting their child. It's none of those things. It's families that lack the resources, often because of these other broken systems and these other systems that are set up against them, that they lack the resources. And rather than help them, they take their children from them and they break these families apart and they put them into foster care. And then they give those resources that they didn't give them to foster parents. That's where the irony is. So when you hear people talking about defunding and things, they're not talking about hanging kids out to dry. What they're talking about is, rather than give money to strangers to raise the children, maybe we could give those same resources to their families and keep their families together and their communities together.
So there's no reunification.
Exactly. And this one, it also says our families belong together. So I think those are two really important points. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So the path to racial equity and child welfare, valuing family and community. So we're going to talk a little bit about the recommendations for the path to racial equity, which are from the Alliance's Whole Families, Whole Communities campaign. So the vision is all families will have equitable access to services and supports, regardless of their socioeconomic background, race, or ethnicity. As a result, no child will be at greater risk of entering or aging out of foster care based on these characteristics. Recommendations are to limit the neglect removals, pre-petition legal representation, which we're going to definitely talk a little bit more about, and restructure visitation and reunification services. So again, these are some of the things that we hit upon on the last slide. These neglect removals are one of the worst things really for Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. They leave way too much discretion. The word is way too subjective. And these cases don't need to lead to removals. They need resources, not to take children away from their families. So the restructuring, visitation, and reunification services, that's just another thing to try to support families. I know as a parent's attorney, it's really difficult for a lot of parents because they're given these nearly impossible case plans where they need to complete all these different services, even often things that are not tailored to what brought them into court in the first place. The parent might have no history whatsoever of substance abuse, but yet they require them to sign up for drug testing weekly, random. They also need to keep a job. They also need to find time to, visit with their child twice a week during the set boundaries that work for the court and for, the monitor and for everyone but the parent. And it's nearly impossible to do all of those things. Oftentimes they have them meeting out in places where they have no transportation, no means of getting there, hours away from where they're living. Children are often placed in foster homes hours away from where their parents are living. When they have these monitored visits and have another person involved, another person scheduled involved, another person's biased attitudes involved, another person who's watching you and policing you, who maybe doesn't even have a lot of training or experience, who's reporting back things to the social worker that's often not even accurate or fair representation of what happened. And with pre-petition legal representation, I do just want to say that was one of the big things that happened on Tuesday at the Board of Supervisors meeting, is that they did pass their motion. It was agenda item 31 on advancing pre-petition legal representation, because parents oftentimes, a lot of damage happens before they ever have an attorney. before they ever get to court, where that's where they finally meet their attorney for the first time, usually get 5 minutes, 10 minutes in the hallway where there's people running around, children screaming, and you get maybe 10 minutes, if you're lucky, to run through a bunch of forms with your attorney and go through the motions. And before that's ever even happened, you've made all these statements to the social worker, most of which have been twisted, most of which have been misrepresented in reports. And then, as Yahniie was saying, those reports are treated like they are absolute facts, that they are truth. The burden is so low that once they're in reports, it's almost impossible to overcome and prove that that's not true and that that's not what you said. I want to give Yahniie a chance to speak here.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what happened to me, right? And also what happened to my mom. And I think that was why the phone call happened this week, because it's a part of, like, literally, vindication for her on some level. And also, I want to talk about just specifically with my situation where my daughter was right down the street. But being beaten up by all of these accusations, by being incarcerated and trying to piece your life back together, being served on Christmas with the arresting officer, right? Who made the statement that he wanted to take my child, and knowing that they won in that way, that is defeating. And I didn't know how to feel having to walk to go visit my daughter every day, and not being able to bring her back home, right? And so in addition to all of these other things, just think about where the parent is. And a lot of time, kids are removed and placed very, very far from, and very, very far from the families. Just the drug testing, right? And so that's a daily, you have to call daily at a certain time for the random drug test, and don't miss a drug test because they're going to claim that you're dirty, awesome. Right? So I didn't have never had a substance abuse issue, right? But I had to do that for a year. By the time my daughter and I got done with services, we were so exhausted. We didn't even want to fight back. We didn't want to do a lawsuit. We were just so therapy every week, 2 social workers a week, right? Coming to the house for something that was falsified, right? And you have no voice. So yeah, we're on our way to winning.
Thanks, Yahniie. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So then this is just a little bit about the Reimagine Child Safety Coalition, and by all means doesn't even really come close to really summarizing all of the different demands and different things that we've been working on as a coalition, but similar vision to what we saw on the last slide, a world in which the safety of children is not determined by the economic status of their families and parents are not deemed unsafe or unfit based on the color of their skin. Some of the demands here that we listed are ending partnerships between law enforcement and DCFS. So that was one of the first demands that the coalition worked on before it even was officially a coalition. It was a campaign, the Reimagine Child Safety campaign, and there was a petition. I think you can actually still sign on to it now, but there was a change.org petition, and it was about ending the partnerships between law enforcement and DCFS, because DCFS is supposed to be here to help the children, not to team up with law enforcement to over-police Black and Brown families. And then we've got ending detentions based on general neglect, like we've talked about a lot, domestic violence experienced by parent, guardian, positive drug test during pregnancy or at birth. I want to expand a little bit on those. So with the domestic violence situations, it's very difficult because parents a lot of times feel kind of damned if they do, damned if they don't. If you don't, go and try to get help for yourself, you risk, obviously the danger of, physical harm to yourself, also other kind of non-physical harms, and also to your children. You also risk the harm of somebody else reporting and DCFS getting involved and then looking at you because you weren't the one who reported it. But then oftentimes when people do go and report it and do try to get help, and I'm saying people because we know oftentimes it is women, but it's not always women. But when you do go and, report it and try to get help, a lot of times these parents still end up in dependency court, and not just the parent who's the abuser, but the parent who's the victim as well. And they're in court for a failure to protect their children, even though the reason that the system may be found out is because that's exactly what they were trying to do. I know that Chris is a really big part of the coalition, and he's had some op-eds and things, and, you know, shared stories of clients he's had, and a mother who said, you know, I guess I should have just let him keep beating the shit out of me because I tried to get help and now my whole family's getting torn apart. So that's something that, you know, really needs a lot of help and a lot of change. Also the drug testing, you know, they test the mothers just as a matter of cause, you know, and even if there's no reason to believe that someone is under the influence of drugs, and, you know, it just gets used against these parents. And these are all parts of our demands and incorporated in different demands, eliminating the drug testing by DCFS and by hospital staff for pregnant, laboring, and postnatal people. And Yahniie, I feel like you want to say something on that. Okay. Just wanted to make sure. And so I know for the coalition, one of the things that I think is included in your materials is what was sent to the Board of Supervisors the day before Tuesday's meeting. And the Reimagine Child Safety Coalition, we launched our coalition officially to the Board of Supervisors and presented a list of demands back on November 16th of last year, calling on the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors to reimagine child safety and hold the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services accountable for meeting the needs of children and families across the county. We urge them to review and revise its policies and take action relating to DCFS and associated agencies accordingly. But since that time, while our coalition's been meeting with all the supervisors' offices to discuss the demands and share some of our preliminary policy recommendations before they were formalized into now completed briefs, 6 months later, which was Monday, May 16th, after the initial outreach, minimal action has been taken and no substantive changes have been made. So that's one of the reasons why the coalition was rallying outside of the supervisors meeting on Tuesday and giving public comment in the meeting. The family regulation system, still perceived by many to function and protect children, typically has the opposite impact. Instead of increasing child safety, removing children from their families often produces devastating outcomes, including exceedingly low graduation rates, high incarceration rates, poor health outcomes, and high rates of physical and sexual violence experienced while in foster care. The family regulation system is rooted in centuries of violence, white supremacy, and attempted cultural genocide. As the largest locally run so-called child welfare agency in the nation, the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services is a key player in this racist system, causing irreparable harm and trauma by needlessly ripping apart thousands of families annually. So in an effort to expedite relief for families, we submitted our developed policy recommendations to accompany each of our demands. And the recommendations offer a plan to address some of DCFS's most inequitable policies and practices and identify proven strategies that can keep children safe while simultaneously preventing families from being ripped apart. And one of those recommendations is the pre-petition advocacy, which was passed by the Board of Supervisors. So that's definitely a success for the coalition, as well as some of the goals that I know the Alliance policy team had as well. So if we want to jump to the next slide. This is just some stuff for you to take back to your organizations and think about when you want to compare the policy recommendations developed by the Alliance and those from the Reimagine Child Safety Coalition. You can see that there are some similarities. You can also see that there are some differences, which recommendations apply a reform framework, which apply an abolitionist framework, and which recommendations are hard to categorize. A lot of times in the coalition, we talk about things like non-reformist reform and, you know, all these things because, you know, some people kind of recognize that, you know, we're not going to be able to push everyone to just become abolitionists overnight. And we don't want to just keep working with the system the way it is in the meantime. So how can you, you know, work with what we have? And so that gets into some of those ways where it's hard to categorize, where, maybe the ultimate goal is abolition, but maybe in the meantime, we have to also work on some reform. So if we can go to the next slide, and some more questions to think about with which framework: expand the primary prevention services to support families before maltreatment occurs, guaranteeing basic income for all families. We know that poverty is really one of the #1 reasons why families are ending up in the system in the first place, whether it be the child welfare system or the criminal injustice system or whatever it may be. It gives families in crisis the option to seek help from behavioral health specialists rather than law enforcement. We know that law enforcement is not cut out and trained to be dealing with mental health crises. A lot of families call the police when they have a loved one dealing with those crises, and rather than get the help that they're seeking, a lot of times it leads to tragic outcomes, sometimes people getting killed. They're not the right ones to respond to this. Make child and family team meetings more culturally competent. And that's something also that the Board of Supervisors has had on the agenda since that November meeting was one of the meetings they had that on the agenda. Even just more cultural competency, even in terms of languages, and just having people not be putting people in the system just because they don't speak Spanish and didn't understand what they were saying. Establish an independent civilian oversight committee led by parents or people with lived experiences to allocate funding to family preservation focused programs. And this is another one of our demands and recommendations that are part of the coalition as well. So thank you. And I'm going to hand it back over to Sabrina now, unless Yahniie has anything else. I do want to just throw a shout out to the coalition though. ReimagineChildSafety.org. You can check stuff out on our coalition and track what's going on with that. And definitely happy to have people join on who are in the fight to reimagine child safety and make, fundamental change to the system we currently have. Thank you everyone for your time. Yahniie?
Yeah. I dropped the email in there, and I'm going to drop it again in the chat for everybody to, if you want more information about Reimagine Child Safety Coalition, you can send an email.
Thanks all.
Right, thanks. Thank you, Sarah and Yahniie. So I'm going to talk about policy developments and how some of these conversations are playing out at the policy level. And a big question that I think underlies the dichotomy between reform and abolition, and how it comes to be that someone with a reformist mindset might have the same recommendations as someone with an abolitionist mindset is the question of who. Like, who is providing the prevention services? Who is facilitating what we can call child and family team meetings, but what are basically convenings to help address the needs of the family? And I think there's been more of a discussion over time about shifting these functions from the child welfare system to the community-based organizations that have really fine-tuned expertise on the community's needs. And so that's something that keeps on coming up at the county level, at the state level, at the federal level. Let's allocate a ton of money to prevention to get at the root of some of the systemic income inequality. But who do we give the money to? Do we make child welfare bigger and have them provide the prevention services, or do we give the money back to the community so that they can deliver the services? So that's one important component to think about as we talk about policy. I'm not going to break down this entire diagram, but this is a useful and thorough life cycle of the legislative process. And that's where I do a lot of my work on state legislation. And, the process of thinking through a reform starts, we're talking about bills that we want to run next year right now in the middle of a current legislative session where we're still trying to get bills passed. So this is the time to start kind of developing idea generation, reaching out to members of the Assembly and members of the Senate and saying, hey, we have a really good critical idea for next year, because bills get introduced in January and February and then have to go through one or more policy committees, a fiscal committee, if there's going to be any particular cost, which is usually the case when we're talking about child welfare services or funding that's getting diverted out of child welfare services. Then there has to be agreement among both houses of the legislature and the governor's office. And when we talk about the governor's office and the administration, we're also including all of the state agencies that are involved in implementing this work. So when we're talking about foster care system change, strategic change, then we're not just appealing to the governor's office and the assembly and the Senate, but also the Department of Social Services and sometimes the Department of Healthcare Services and the Office of the Health and Human Services Agency. So a lot of people and institutions need to be aligned in order for state law change to happen. And all of us here are not in the decision-making role, we're in the advocacy role. And I think we're comfortably and happily in that role of kind of pushing the thinking of decision makers to be more equitable and more just, and to ensure accountability via input from communities and organizations that are directly impacted, and to develop the technical expertise and political expertise to push change and persuade decision makers. So on that vein, I wanted to let you all know about a couple of new policies that have recently been enacted with kind of the vision of removing disproportionalities and disparities in the system. And then I'll talk in the next slide about some proposals that are pending in the legislature that could potentially further these goals. So one bill that Sarah alluded to is Senate Bill 354. That was successfully passed by the legislature and signed by the governor last year. It went into effect January 1st of 2022. So this is law. This is policy in place, and it addressed the issue that Sarah talked about, which is if a known adult in a child's life is available to become a foster care placement, a resource family home, that is a great thing because the child is more likely to reunify with their parents. They are more likely to retain their community and cultural ties, and there are all kinds of good data-driven outcomes related to education and mental health associated with that kind of relative care. However, as Sarah mentioned, we have volumes and volumes of stories of caregivers who are relatives and who had been barred from resource family approval because of a conviction history that was deemed by federal and state law to be non-exemptable. There's no way to get around it. And so SB 354 adds flexibility by allowing the child welfare, allowing the social worker and the RFA worker to grant an exemption for a conviction that previously had just a complete bar to approval. That family can receive approval as long as, the family member shows good character and rehabilitation, or whatever the legal term is. It basically shows that they are somebody who can provide care for the child, and then it's in the child's best interest to live with that caregiver. And it also allows for the court to place a child with a caregiver, notwithstanding the existence of a conviction. This is still all discretionary. It's not requiring approval in these circumstances, but counties were articulating to advocates that they wanted to exercise that discretion in a way that increased placement with families, notwithstanding some old criminal conviction that isn't relevant. And so Senator Skinner from Berkeley, California, shepherded that law, and the Alliance was a co-sponsor, but it was really driven by the Free Coalition and A New Way of Life and many other partners whose input into SB 354 was really driven by their lived experience. So shout out to them. Another bill that successfully moved through the legislature and off the governor's desk last year and went into effect in January is AB 670. And that was not co-sponsored by us. That was co-sponsored by the Children's Law Center of California and Mara's team at Public Counsel. And it addresses the story that Yahniie really made real for us and is really endemic in the system, which is that there is a pipeline, this intergenerational pipeline into foster care for parenting foster youth. And so AB 670 takes some steps to make sure that if a child is removed while the parent is in foster care, that services should not be bypassed. They should be receiving reunification services. And also they shouldn't be investigated unless there's actually a referral for abuse and neglect or a reason to think that abuse and neglect is happening. There can't just be an investigation because the parent herself or themselves is in foster care. There shouldn't be that added surveillance just by virtue of being in the system. So that has gone into effect, although it's pending some guidance by the state. And then another really exciting new policy that went into effect technically last year as part of the budget process is funding for guaranteed basic income pilots, which you've heard about a couple of times over the course of this presentation. But basically, counties will be able to develop programs to provide a basic level of income to individuals with experience in the foster care system and or individuals with who are parenting and can develop programs at the county level to kind of prioritize and figure out eligibility. And there has been clarification at the legislative level that this basic income that the families would receive would be a supplement to whatever they're receiving through the foster care system, through CalWorks, through CalFresh, through SSI, and is considered income on top of that. It shouldn't be a replacement, because people were worried that if they were to participate in a guaranteed basic income pilot, they wouldn't be able to, they would lose eligibility for other longer term sources of funding, which would put them back in the situation that they were in before. So that's really exciting. Guaranteed basic income is an idea that was kind of seen as an idea to be incubated at very limited kind of county levels. And it's really an idea whose time has come in thinking through how to address what has become a poverty and homelessness crisis in our state. So that funding will be dispersed over the course of this year. And then there are some proposals that have not made it through the entire legislative process yet. We're still in the middle of the legislative session for this year. We're almost exactly at the midpoint, but just wanted to give you a preview of what might be coming through the legislative pipeline this year. So one bill is AB 2665. That's being sponsored by the Children's Law Center and a broader coalition of advocates that would provide funding for blind removal pilots, which Sarah talked about earlier. Los Angeles County is already undertaking its own blind removal pilot, and this bill would make available the resources to pilot blind removal statewide. So counties would develop their own protocols to remove identifying racial, ethnic, other kinds of demographic information, including zip code, anything that could be predictive of race and ethnicity. And then they would evaluate their pilot after a certain number of years and use it to drive county policy and hopefully state policy going forward. So that bill is still moving through the legislature. I think it's on the assembly floor. AB 2085. These are, interestingly, all of these bills are being carried by assembly members who represent districts in LA. So these are policymakers who are serving you. So AB 2085 is designed to reform the mandated reporting system and really limit the reports that are made based on general neglect, which we've come to find are largely based on poverty or kind of this like, this kid is coming to school with dirty clothes or they don't have food to eat and I need to do something and I don't know, I'll just call the CPS hotline based on general neglect. And kind of hoping to give mandated reporters more clarity in what kinds of abuse and neglect cases they have to or can report. And then AB 2159, that's Assemblymember Bryan's bill. is focused on a narrow but super important issue, which is that there are federally mandated timelines to provide, but then also terminate reunification services. And those timelines don't get suspended when a parent is unable to participate in reunification services, chiefly because they're in detention. And there's a poverty bias that occurs particularly for pretrial detention, because basically that's just saying, we're going to terminate your reunification services because your timeline has run and you weren't able to afford bail. And so this would clarify that reunification services shouldn't be terminated for a parent who hasn't been able to participate in those services because they're in pretrial detention simply because they can't afford bail. So all of those bills are about to move out of the Assembly and to the Senate. The Senate then has to pass those bills. And then if the Senate does that, then it'll go to the governor's desk. So there's lots of opportunity for advocacy to support these efforts and to talk to your policymakers about why those efforts are really important in reforming and transforming the systems that you work in or interface with on a regular basis. All right, Mara, looks like you're up.
Thank you, Sabrina. I feel like folks probably need a collective exhale. This is a lot of information and a lot of really difficult information. I know that we said we would hold off on questions till the end, but I noticed someone said we are giving a bit quickly. So I just want to clarify that what happened that we see as a really positive step at the Board of Supervisors recently. The request of advocates, and most importantly of those with lived experience, that parents be provided with legal counsel before their case goes to court, was supported conceptually by the Board of Supervisors. They passed a motion saying that the county, and I may be getting the terminology wrong, my colleagues can help me, that the county should conduct a feasibility study with the hopes that this protocol would be implemented in, within the year. It's hopeful that it will actually happen, that the study will show this is not only feasible, but it's moral, it's practical, and obviously could, in a fiscal sense, unclog courts, prevent unneeded detentions. Let's see, is anybody? Yeah, Yahniie says, can't imagine them saying no. So we're pretty confident this is going to happen, and I hope that clarifies for whoever put in that question why we're so excited. And yeah, Yahnie's right. This would be a game changer, and I hope after the context we provided all morning, folks can see why that's the case. So watch out for news about that. It will be huge. There are little pilot projects going on in LA County right now at the Children's Law Center, which represents most of the youth in care. They're trying to help parenting youth who are at risk of having their babies detained with early legal representation. And at Public Counsel, we support that work a bit too. And there are many success stories. It just doesn't need to happen as often as it does or at all. So this is one very important movement of the reform agenda, and we hope it's just the beginning. So it's true, as we've been acknowledging all morning, that many of us work in child welfare, in the education system, in the housing system, in the health systems, all of those systems that are rife with inequity. So we have to consider the ethical challenges that present themselves when we work within or adjacent to these kind of systems that are not equitable. Before I launch into a conversation about this issue, I just want to say one more time that it's my honor to be an ally to young parents like Yahniie. And I also want to state that as a white woman, no matter how much I work with these families, I'm cognizant I can never fully understand the experience of the Black, Brown, and Indigenous families separated and regulated by the system. And I was asked to share today some of the tools and strategies we on the panel use to attempt at least to avoid perpetuating harm, and that's what I'm about to do. I acknowledge I still, and I hope forever, have much to learn, and I welcome feedback. So next slide, please. So we did a lot of brainstorming amongst ourselves as panelists about what do we do? What do we do when we work in environments and organizations that are, you know, maybe just beginning the journey to reform and certainly not abolitionists. And we talked about how a key ethical challenge we encounter is that many of us fail to lift up the voices of those most impacted by the system intervention. And you can see today, if we do not center the voices of those folks, we lose such wisdom and we lose important ideas. We lose the answers about how to be more just, how to create more supportive systems that will help children and families thrive. So that's where we wanted to begin, is to make sure in your work, whichever arena it's in, that you center the voices of those with the lived experience. And I'm not talking about saying, oh, we have a person of color on this committee, check the box. Or in my case, oh, we put 3 young parents on our panel, so we're covered. This means creating real opportunities for the people with lived experience to lead the way, to have power and voice and choice. And so that's where we wanted to begin, by, even if you're in an imperfect environment, there's a lot you can do just by centering these voices. Next, keep doing what we're doing today. Yeah, Yahniie, do you want to add anything now about what you mean by incorporating lived experience in development? You're talking about policy development?
And everything. So a lot of time, I think over the last 10 years, lived experience has become like this hot, you know, word. But I think that now we're moving into a space where it's like, oh yes, we have lived experience there. And we created the presentation and we presented it to them afterwards for them to approve or deny, right? And I think that lived experience has to be a part of the development of whatever the presentation is as well, and the development of the conversation and the part of the brainstorming, not the afterthought. So
100%. Not just a part of the development, but the leader of the development. What do you think this committee, this presentation, this policy effort should focus on and lead us in that? Not, here's what we're thinking, tell us your opinion. Thank you for adding in that piece from the very beginning. And the next bullet is basically saying, we don't know what we don't know. I mean, even Yahniie, who's one of the most powerful young advocates I know, shared how she learned more of the context today. So educate ourselves, continually work to understand the history of racism in our systems, in our structures, and in our policies, and how that history is not old, how it continues into the present day, and the impact that that is having, and how we need to make major policy shifts if there's really hope of ending that inequity. The third bullet, Yahniie and I talked a lot about. you know, when we have a client who complains about the system being biased, many of you probably have had an experience where that client, you've offered them a resource that you know will help them, that will give them skills or meet a court case plan demand. And the client is fearful of accessing that resource. It's crucial that we hear them out, that we listen to what scares them about it. Like Yahniie, I'm going to end up under a microscope. I'm going to end up reported. Yeah, this may be great. It may teach me a lot, but it doesn't feel safe. We have to validate that fear. We have to listen to it. We have to acknowledge that we are working, as Yahniie said, within a system that has a lot of bias, a lot of oppression, a lot of inequity. And just that little acknowledgement is one key strategy to make sure, even if you're working, you know, within these systems or adjacent to them, that you are minimizing harm, that you are saying, this is real. And I have to do that all the time. I have a client I work with who's a young Black mom, and she kept complaining about headaches during a pregnancy, and kept complaining, and the medical providers, you know, just kind of said, oh, it's nothing, you're fine. And she ended up needing a shunt put in her brain shortly before she delivered her baby, who it was a healthy delivery. But when she kept saying, I know something's wrong, I know this isn't in my head, I encouraged and supported her to keep using her voice and get the attention that she needed. So she wasn't imagining this. And notice, that's the healthcare system. So what Sabrina pointed out goes to our next bullet. This young lady's experience goes to our next bullet. This is bigger than child welfare. This is part of our entire society's structure, where going back to day one, we, you know, it really struck me. I took a note of my colleagues' words, and I can't find it right now, but how our policies, even in supposedly forward-thinking states like California, really, sorry, I'm bad at reading the chat and talking at the same time. I'll revisit Yahnie's comment in a second. That we really continue to pass policies and different laws and pieces of legislation that clearly marginalize and harm our lowest income communities and our communities where people of color live. And so we have to be real that this is going on. And so, Yahniie, I want to just address what you're saying. Yes, I think that's a great idea. When folks are going to the doctor and getting, you know, being gaslit, having experiences like my client, ask them to get an after report in writing. That is always a great way to advocate. And even when you're doing this work, when you're advocating for a client and someone within some system refuses to do something that is supposedly their obligation, there's a gentle way to say, hey, can you send me an email explaining why they're being denied this service or support? And then typically that gives you a pathway to then work around that and demonstrate that they are entitled to that support. So I also want to emphasize that even when we think we're enlightened, even those of us doing this work may be very aware of oppression, very aware of our own privilege. It's still not uncommon for implicit bias to insidiously work its way into our practice. And so it's crucial to do a couple of things: consult, consult, and consult some more. Consult with your colleagues, supervisors, mentors, and with your clients. It's a constant mandate for self-awareness. Is this committee I'm on perpetuating systemic inequity? Is this a committee I want to be part of? Do I believe in the work they're doing? Are the outcomes they're setting for our work going to move us toward equity, or perhaps just continue harmful practices? We can't go on just doing work because it's part of our job without asking ourselves those questions. If we are concerned, don't just cut and run. Ask yourself how you can push back on that. Think about, is there a way I can, we're not suggesting you risk your employment, but is there a way we can begin a conversation? Because again, many people we work with don't have a conscious awareness of the bias in their decisions, in their discussions. And so just gently instigating conversations about, gee, I wonder if we've thought about the impact this might have and if it will be equitable. And so it's really about being committed to good old-fashioned trauma-informed practice. And I would say it requires us to pause and to be really intentional before we interact with a client, with a colleague, and a coalition, before we testify. And in that pause, prepare ourselves for those interactions to be really trauma-informed and client-centered. We have agendas, right? You need to get someone to bring you this information, to sign this form, to give you an answer, and that's your agenda. But maybe you need to allow for several meetings with that client. Maybe you need to slow down your committee work because those you're interacting with might not have the same agenda as you and might not be capable of doing things on your time frame. So I constantly have to prepare myself for thinking about what my clients, my colleagues are really prepared to do in this next interaction. So we can slow down and avoid defensiveness. And we talked a lot about this. And what we mean is that it's not this false dichotomy of either we're good or we're bad. We're woke or we're not. We're biased or we're not. We mean that we can own that we both work in an imperfect environment and that we are still learners and that we are doing our part to reduce the perpetuation of all these harms we've discussed today. And we talked about creativity. How can you help your clients get their needs met despite the barriers they encounter? How can you push the needle on these policy reforms despite the resistance? It's persist, be that little children's book, The Little Engine That Could. We may be exhausted. Yes, Yahniie, thank you. I love that. Lean into the discomfort. That fits very well with what I was just going to say. A lot of us, I imagine, are exhausted by the state of the world, let alone the effort our work takes. But I always say, if we're exhausted, imagine what it feels like to be our clients and to be the oppressed communities. So we have to consider our end game and have the courage to advocate for movement toward that end. Next slide, please. So it's been described throughout our presentation today that it's time we shift our approach from punitive laws and rules to creating what many are calling a family well-being system. Imagine that. If that same money way back in the 60s that was, you know, being front loaded for out-of-home care went into supporting families, whether through things like guaranteed income pilots, through creating, you know, living wage opportunities for everyone, equal housing opportunities for those who are struggling, making sure services are available. We need to assure that families have their basic needs met. And then you could see from the data presented today, it will be the rare instance when concrete services and supports can't address a family's struggles. So all of our efforts have to move toward a shift to an environment where seeking help is actually viewed as a sign of strength and resiliency, not bad parenting. And so we want families to feel safe to seek support without fear of being drawn into this terrifying reactive system like Yahniie so sadly had to experience. We have to stop treating food or housing instability as criminal acts on the parts of parents and understand that we can't stigmatize poverty, that we as a society are greatly at fault for creating. And we can reduce structural barriers through all these different pathways we talked about today. Join one of these coalitions. Write a letter of support. If one of those policies sounded good to you, reach out to us. We'll tell you how you can help encourage their passage. We need a policy change. Instead of investigating a family that's facing eviction, make a call to legal aid and not the hotline. Connect to community and social services, not to CPS. We are in the trenches. You saw today that I'm gonna wager that Yahniie sharing her experience was the most educational piece of our time together this morning. We know the stories. We are working with people like Yahniie every day. So it is our obligation to get those stories to the ears and hearts of those with the power to change things. So how do you navigate this ethical challenge of, wow, I work in this system that's so inequitable? Get the stories out there, and that will help get the needle moved a little bit. We also want to talk about breaking down silos. I imagine many of us are aware that our systems are so territorial, siloed, do a lot of not my job. And so families are sent on the proverbial wild goose chase, right? They might reach out for support, take that risk, and then they're subjected to ineffective assessment tools that are typically not culturally appropriate. Then they're told, oh, you need to go somewhere else for this, go over there. And then the same process happens again, or worse yet, they're told, oh, this service doesn't exist anymore. So we need to advocate for improved collaboration between all of the systems and agencies and organizations that could strengthen families. Yahniie, you're making me laugh. We don't want someone, every door should be wide open when a family tries to walk through a door with support or service. We don't want to hear, oh, you don't fit the definition of homelessness yet, so go ahead and actually live on the street instead of couch surfing, and then we'll help your family. We want a system where supports are going to be rolled out for anybody that seeks them. So we can work harder, and we must work harder for what we're calling this no wrong door policy. So before I wrap up and move us to the Q&A, I want to say, do these strategies require a lot of work? Absolutely. Does it seem even more daunting maybe now than ever, given the current political context? Sure. But I heard a quote the other day that hope is the greatest weapon. And I hope that you believe, as I do, that that's true. And I want to end with a story. I taught my first week of summer school the other day, and I was acknowledging to my students that these are very challenging times. And I decided to survey them. I wanted to get a sense of where they're at, how present they felt they could be for a new summer course of learning. And many of them said they are fearful now, more than they've ever been, and very concerned about current events. And yet, when I asked true, untrue, I feel, I'm looking at my statement. What was it? I said, I still have hope that it's possible to create a more just society and make headway on social justice initiatives. And you know what? In every section I taught, 100% of them said true. So I hope everyone in this room is as heartened by hearing this as I am, and that you feel inspired to continue to fight for more equitable and ethical systems, and for strengthening our communities and our families and giving them all what they need so they can thrive. So I want to ask if any of my fellow panelists want to add anything more about walking this line, navigating this ethical challenge of doing our work in systems that aren't quite perfect at this time. Anybody want to add anything? Sabrina, Yahniie, Sarah?
I think you really did a great job of covering it. And just, I think all of it is daunting, but I think what's even more daunting is the fact that there are families still going through this right now. Right now, there's some child being snatched away. There are people crying at the courts right now. There's a child being abused with a stranger. Right now, these things are happening. Families are being incarcerated, things like that. So change is gonna be uncomfortable. Any type of change in personal development, it's all uncomfortable, but I think like this is part of what we signed up to do. And I think we really just have to be intentional and take care of ourselves as we do it, because we're still also experiencing secondary trauma and things like that, having to witness these things. So yeah.
Yahniie, I so appreciate you added that. I usually incorporate that into every week of my classes, and it would have been negligent not to sort of wrap up with that. You know, we were talking the other day, right, about self-care not being aftercare. We need to do it again. That's why I like that pause. There are all those cliches. You can tell I'm cliche happy. You can't pour from an empty cup and all those other things. So I'm with you, Yahniie. I implore each and every one of us doing this work to take care of yourselves and continue to find maybe an entire toolbox of strategies to fuel yourself to continue doing this work we signed up for. Sabrina, Sarah, want to add anything else?
I don't want to follow Yahniie, but right? I did have something to share. I know that the theme, we have not addressed one theme of this conference, which is about, you know, pursuing justice and equity in a capitalistic system. And I think I would be remiss to acknowledge that our capitalistic system is really output and outcome driven and is not designed for that pause. And so much unsexy policy work and storytelling needs to go into like educating decision makers and educating people who hold the purse strings that the way towards a more equitable society actually means building in resources to slow down and incorporate, and not just say, you know, provide services to 100 people in a year, but like actually build power among a community over the course of a year, which may look very different. So I think that that's where a lot of folks, and myself included, falter when it comes to including lived experience and the voices of directly impacted people, is like, we don't have enough time. We need to get this thing out the door by X deadline because some external pressure said so. And so we'll have to do this more inclusive presentation or policy campaign later, and then later never comes. And a lot of that has to do with the churn of the society that we live in. So modeling that and pushing back on the idea that high output is the most productive and effective way to do things is critical.
And I would just say, you know, even though it sounds really corny, like be the change, you know, because, you know, I was a public defender for 6 years also before doing, you know, dependency stuff, even though I worked with a lot of lawyers who were dependency lawyers even then. And, you know, one of the things that really struck me, you know, coming back to Los Angeles and going and working in the dependency court was how different things could be from one court to one court. You know, the way things are there, you know, the case gets put into a court, and unless your lawyer files a motion that they only have one chance to file to send it to another judge or one of the other attorneys on the case does, that's the courtroom that your case stays in. And, you know, for me, it was really difficult to see that, you know, if person, you know, A's case comes in and person B's case come in, person A ends up in front of one judge and person B ends up in front of another judge with completely, with the same kind of issue, that they could have completely different outcomes just because of the judge there before, just because of the case social worker at DCFS assigned to their case, just because of the attorney that was appointed to represent, you know, the parents, or the attorney that was appointed to represent the children. And all that can really make such an impact on the case. So, you know, one person can make that difference. And I think, you know, hearing Yahniie share her experiences today should tell you that, you know, she didn't have to have somebody stepping outside of maybe what was the normal, you know, inside the box. And, you know, she had people that were willing to color outside the lines for her. And I'm not telling you all to, you know, violate every rule and get yourselves into trouble and get fired and all this stuff, but there's ways to come up with those creative solutions and paint outside the lines a little bit and think outside the box and come up with things that are about the individual. Because you know, too often parents and youth that are in the system people try to force them into these, you know, cookie cutter things, and not everybody fits into the cookie cutter, you know, and you have to address each client and each person as an individual, and you have to individualize their case plan and their needs to them. And like Mara was saying, you can't make it about you. It's not about you. You have to leave your ego at the door. You can't be defensive. You have to think about not what your life's been about and how you wouldn't have done something like that when you were that age, or you would never make such a decision because you didn't have their life. And so the decisions that you make are based on your life trajectory and the experiences you've had, which are going to be different from those that your clients have had. And so, you know, when you're working with certain youth, it's like I worked with the parents, now I'm working with, you know, the older youth that have gone through the system. And, you know, it's hard to not just say that pretty much any client coming to me has been failed by the system in some way. You know, they either were never, you know, taken from their family and were never adopted and went from group home to group home or foster home to foster home and suffered a lot of traumas. And a lot of them did end up on the streets with no transition planning from DCFS. A lot of them were kind of used by foster parents to, get that check. And once they hit a certain age and that money wasn't coming in the same way, all of a sudden they were disenfranchised from those families. A lot of them were maybe fortunate to be adopted, but once they hit a certain age, their adopted family was like, all right, you're 18, see you later. And we know that a lot of people who are not adopted, they don't have that happen. Their families are still there for them, even after they turn legal age of 18. And so just think about the fact that, if somebody's not calling you back, it might not be just because they're rude and they're disrespectful. It might be because their phone's cut off. It might be because they spent the night on the street that night and lost track of their phone. And there can be a lot of reasons why things are happening. And so I encourage you all to give your clients the benefit of the doubt and think about where they are and putting yourself in their shoes. But also I encourage you to not be paternalistic and to listen to what they say and to not always think that because you're older or because you're more educated or whatever it may be, that you know more than they do and that you know what they need more than they know what they need. So I encourage you to not be paternalistic, to listen to them and to be there for them and to try to be as understanding as you can of their situation, while also knowing that you can't ever possibly 100% understand if you haven't lived that same life and you haven't been through that yourself. So I was like a little soapbox moment, and I'm going to stop.
Well, Sarah, I'm going to give you an honorary MSW because, you hit almost every one of our social work code of ethics. And I want to highlight the non-judgment and tell everybody here that doing the same work as you, my mantra is right to self-determination, right to self-determination. That's in our code of ethics. And I think that's what you were reminding everybody of, that, it's their choice and they have a right. And we just keep on keeping on and being there and supporting the choices they make, understanding the context. Debbie, I know you were going to tell us if there was anything in the Q&A or open up the Q&A. Are there questions we haven't addressed that folks like us to?
Yes, and thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation, and thank you for your dedication. That was so informative. I really appreciate it. You've answered most of the questions. There are a couple, but most of them have been answered. So one question is, and this is from Deborah. I find that families often do not know what resources are even out there to ask. Is education on families on resources and services a part of what you're doing? I find that about 80% of families I speak with don't even know about 211 info online.
I think that all of our organizations do that kind of community education in different ways. Through presentations, through developing materials to get the word out. And I think we have different areas of focus, and then we have community partnerships for particular areas of focus. So, one organization that's not on this panel, but that I want to shout out is a New Way of Life Reentry Project, because they do an incredible amount of information sharing and navigation for parents and also kin caregivers who are impacted by the criminal legal system and the child welfare system, with a real focus on reunification. So when that kind of complex intersystem injustice is happening to those families, I immediately reach out to my contact at Anwal because they're amazing at that. We do a ton of work with kinship caregivers as well. And then maybe Sarah and Mara can speak to what their programs do with Tay, and Yahniie, what kind of supports and information you provide as well.
Yeah, I'll just add to it that the Alliance also has, and I know Public Counsel is the same, websites where we, have a lot of resources and things that are also available on the website. There's a lot of really great information, including links to different webinars and things that will sometimes get posted afterwards. And, we have the Opportunity Youth Collaborative where they have newsletters, and people can subscribe to those newsletters. And also they send out a lot of great resources via those newsletters, as well as announce different webinars that are free that people can sign up for, where a lot of information shared, like Sabrina was saying. They also always have like a Q&A section in the newsletters that has, there'll be like a featured question with an answer. And I mean, I learn a lot from those things when I read them. It's a lot of really great information. And then just also, I know both Alliance and Public Counsel have pretty extensive intake departments as well. So part of the job of the intake team is, processing different referrals, and the ones that we don't keep in-house and send to one of our teams. We have lists of referrals that we'll give to the callers. So those are just some of the ways. And then of course, when we're working directly with our youth, that's one of the things we're doing, is connecting them to different resources and helping them to navigate some of those different referrals like 211, but also just LASA and all kinds of other community resources and referrals.
And I just want to acknowledge that that's an ongoing conundrum. And I really appreciate the question, because there is a lot available, a lot of great resources out there. For example, right now, John Burton Advocates for Youth is trying really hard to get current and former foster youth to take advantage of their volunteer tax preparations services, because we're finding that a disproportionate amount of system-involved youth didn't get their stimulus checks, and young parents didn't get the child care tax credit. And they're getting clients like a minimum of $2,500. We've heard of 2 clients recently who got 15,000 tax refunds. So I was just talking to John Burton yesterday, like, how can we get the word out? There's Instagram, there's our organizations, but that goes back to our theme today. We want some kind of, funding to build these community centers where any parent, any family member can go and find out what's available for what kind of need and access it without fear of repercussions. But Yahniie, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and I know that CSSJ, Californians for Safety and Justice, or CSJ, is doing a lot of work around trauma recovery centers that will be providing resources as well. I'm going to kind of step into my community member role. So a lot of the positions that I've had in case management background based on my ability to navigate resources and connect folks to resources, but literally it's a part of my life, right? So walking out in the community, you see somebody, you're having a conversation, and there's a need that could be met, and connecting them, I think it's a community responsibility. And sometimes it can be a little bit much, because it's like you're always on. You're never really off. But I think, we use the term disenfranchised communities a lot, and that means exactly what it means. There are a lot of families and community members that are not connected to nonprofits in the way that maybe I am and the way that my peers are. So when you see folks that are disconnected, just making sure, even as organizations, just making sure we're a little more creative about how we do outreach to tap into these families that don't have the support.
Okay, thank you. So there are a couple more questions and comments that have come in. Can you speak to, is there any support for new policies that have been seen by leadership at DCFS? Where are they at with these policies that you're proposing?
It's difficult to know during this transition where DCFS doesn't have a director.
Okay.
I think a lot of progress was stalled during that transition. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
Well, the advocacy organizations do meet with, both of our organizations and a few others do meet with leadership. And is it just the optimist in me, or would you all agree that they're fairly responsive? When we try to walk the walk, what I've been saying today, we bring issues that we become aware of through our work and say, this is what's really happening out there. And we think you should change this or add this or do that. And I'm not saying they go, sure, tomorrow. But I do think that is one mechanism where we've been able to move things a little bit. I think, does the Alliance agree? We've had little successes through that mechanism. But it has to happen on that large scale level. And we're excited to see who the new permanent director will be. And they'll be hearing from the community. Yahnie's face. What, Yahnie?
I have no faith. I'm not gonna lie. I have no faith. I know we've had, these successes and conversations, but I do feel like we really gotta, it's hard for the directors to really reimagine what this looks like. And it's tough because also I heard that they are getting contacted every time a child is harmed or a child dies, and that could impact their mental health and things like that. But this is similar to the conversations that I had when we were doing a lot of probation reform, and a lot of the probation officers were afraid of job security, you know what I mean? And my thing was always having conversations with probation officers, we're not trying to take your job from you, but you went to college for something, you know what I mean? You went to college because you wanted to help the community. And so you can use those same skills to help kids in the community, because they'll still need mentors, they'll still need that support. So it just doesn't have to be in jail, right? We don't have to incarcerate kids to get them services. So I think that the same type of paradigm is happening around this child welfare reform. So I don't think that any large major, I don't find it surprising that they're not responding to the Reimagine Child Safety Coalition. It's not surprising to me, right? And that's where it's okay, this is a lot of work. This is going to be a lot of work, but.
Yeah, I think
also, LA is a site, sorry, Sarah, the Casey Foundation has a pilot program called Thriving Family Safe Communities or something like that. And LA is signed up for that. So you can Google for the Casey initiative, and we will see if that moves the needle at all. And I totally understand where Yahnie's coming from. They're even talking about, some people are proposing, let's create two systems, one for those rare instances where there's really danger, and then a bigger system for family well-being. But those are all far down the road. Sarah, what were you going to say?
Yeah, just that stuff like this it does take time, and it really comes down to nothing can really change without there being a cultural shift. And until you can kind of change people's minds, it's really hard to really move things along. As long as people's mindsets are kind of frozen in the past. So, and it does take a lot of, I would say, oversight. And I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why, this rally and everything happened, because in 6 months, I think people expected to see a little bit more movement. And I think, the Board of Supervisors, they have a lot of power. And, for so many different issues in LA County. And so I think it's easy for them to lose focus because, 1 minute you're looking at one thing and then something major happens in the news and draws their focus away. And so, it does take, I think, the pressure of the advocates in the community to keep the pressure on and keep reminding them that we're here, we're not going away. These changes need to happen, and, they needed to happen a long time ago. And this is stuff that really can't just keep waiting. But it really does take that big cultural shift to really, really see that movement too.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this is a question comment. Thank you, amazing folks, for this forum. I'm hoping perhaps there can be similar future opportunity to discuss an abolitionist social work lens with older adults and the nursing home industrial complex, as there is a similar disproportionate effect on BIPOC. So comment, but if anybody wants to take that up. Okay, and this is also, so we've got a few minutes, so I'll read this comment. I'm nearing retirement. I've been working in social work in different settings since 1982. I'm a first generation Mexican and consider myself to be recovering from PTSD from my experiences with racism and discrimination to present. In all settings, including where I currently work, I've relied on the code of ethics and principles to work with my clients. To date, these have guided my work, even when it is or has been apparent odds with the goals and settings that I work with. I have never been fired. I've come close once, but defended myself by bringing the code of ethics and NASW definition to meetings. So
thank you, whoever
that's
shared that,
here.
for your courage and your perseverance, because I hear both. Yeah. You were ready. You knew you needed to step up, and you did it courageously. And thank you for sticking with it.
Okay, so another comment from Deborah Gamina. Yes, a lot of resources. This is back to the resource question, but people don't know to even ask, don't realize there might even be help for something that is stressful to them, such as many have outstanding student loans, $20,000 to $30,000, $1,000 from trade schools, and don't know LAFLA as a department that can see if they may qualify to have these loans forgiven. Such a relief for them when they hear this. Yeah, so.
Yeah, so I mean, feel free to reach out to any of us, our organizations, if people have creative suggestions for improved information sharing. We need to do better, so. Yeah. Thank you all for raising that.
Okay.
I think also what's underlying that comment is also like a social capital comment that's like the information that you have access to is contingent on how well networked and how privileged the people who you spend your days and nights around are. And that's going to be dictated by the neighborhood you live in, the school you go to, the systems you interact with, if any. The most privileged people don't actually have to interact with most systems. And so I think, this is another thing that's bigger than nonprofits. It's bigger than the child welfare system. It's about like what our communities here in Los Angeles look like and how segregated many of them have become and how that's had an impact on the level of social capital that people have. So just wanted to kind of lift up that subtext as well.
I think that's like such a great point, Sabrina, too, because you can see that, how it plays out with the clients. One of the things that I've done a lot of work on is with the citation diversion program and ending that. And, we know that there's thousands and thousands of youth who, got these juvenile citations before they were 18 and never were told about court dates and ended up with failure to appears and holds on their licenses. And a lot of them, they don't know that that's even unresolved until they go when they're 18, 19, 20 to get a license and then find out, guess what, when you were late to the group home, when you were 14, that never got resolved. There's a court date, you didn't even know about it, all of that stuff. And it's like, I would always say that no matter how frustrating the process is for sometimes for the clients and, when we're dealing with it, they're still the lucky ones because there's a whole bunch of other youth out there, thousands and thousands, who have the same exact issue but don't know to come to us. And it's like a lot of the youth that do come to us, it's because they've got a good social worker or a good children's law center attorney, and they know about some of the other resources in the community like Public Counsel and Alliance for Children's Rights and LAFLA, like someone was mentioning, and Neighborhood Legal Services and these other organizations that do certain work that, maybe the attorneys at CLC don't do, but if they know where they can refer the youth, they can still get those done. But it really does come down to, do you have a case? Do you have an attorney? Does your attorney know about this stuff? Do you live in a community where, some of our clients, it's word of mouth. It's like you helped one client on her ticket, and then she told one of her friends she kept in touch with who used to be in the same group home, and guess what? They have a ticket now too, but they wouldn't have known to come to us if this friend hadn't passed that information along. So I think that is a really huge part of it. And I think that's one of the things that we try to also deal with our intake system, because so many of the youth, they might come to us for one issue, but then when we go through the questionnaires with them during intake, there's a lot of other things that come up that they realize, oh, wow, actually, I didn't know you could help me with that too. And maybe they came to us with one issue, but we end up helping them on 3 because they didn't even think to come to us for that.
So I challenge or encourage everyone listening today, take one thing you learned, one thing that moved you, and share it with someone, ideally who doesn't do our work, because without that culture shift, my co-panelists are right. The change will be like molasses. It's going to be slow anyway, but you all were empowered today with a a lot of information that you can share, and so that even people just in the voting booth or in their conversations among friends can shed light on how far we have to go. So please share anything that moved you today, anything you learned about what a lot of people are unintentionally doing to perpetuate these harms and inequities. You can really do that.
Thank you so much. There have been more questions that have come in, but we are actually out of time. So sorry to say.
Well, feel free, anybody who's written a question, to email us or the conference organizers if you want to continue the conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And there are lots of comments of gratitude. So we're so grateful for your presentation today.
We're grateful you came. Thank you.
Well, on behalf of the Social Work Women's Council, we're honored that we were able to spotlight the work that you're doing and give a chance for people to hear and be exposed to really powerful examples of how our systems don't work for people in our community who are Black and Brown and Indigenous, and how that leads to such inequity and harm. And we as social workers have that ethical responsibility to be able to do something about that. This was a wonderful presentation, and I'm really, really glad that all of you were here to hear it. We're at the point now where we're going to be completing our conference program. So I want to just make a couple of announcements to make sure that you understand a few things. Once the full 3 hours of time is ended for this session, you can return to the landing page to complete your evaluation. There'll be a button and you'll be asked to complete one evaluation for today's content and another that addresses the conference as a whole. Please complete that even if you only came today, but definitely if you came our last one as well as this one. For those who did not sign up for CEs, you can still receive a letter documenting your attendance if you complete the evaluations. And we'd also like to request that participants complete an additional evaluation of this conference, which we're going to be sending a link to. This allows the speakers today are so dedicated to what they do, and they want to publicize and get the word out. And they actually sought out and got some funding to help them be able to spread the word in different places to support that work. And so they are also asking that you complete an evaluation survey, which will be able to support the ongoing effort that they've done to really be able to get this out to a wider range of audience. Again, if you'd like more information about the Women's Council, you can email us at SoCalWomen'sCouncil1@gmail.com. Maybe someone can put that in the chat. And if there is additional questions, as Mara mentioned, please feel free to contact us and continue the conversation. There's a lot more we need to do. We need to uplift and empower the voices of people who've experienced the system and our communities, because that's what's going to move policy. It has to come to that. So again, I really want to thank you for being here. We're happy that you've joined, and I wish you a very wonderful weekend. Take care. Bye, everyone. So I know we had a lot more questions, but we did really well in being able to get to some of them. Those of you who are on the panel, if you want to take a look at the questions and there's any that you would be able to give us answers, we could potentially send that out along with the link.
I believe we're still recording. I didn't know if you wanted that.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, we are. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you for noticing that. So anyway, I think we'll go ahead and close down. This says this webinar is being recorded. Did it end? No, it didn't end yet. Okay.
I think I can press the stop recording button if everyone's okay with it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.